We usually start our Kinot study program by looking at some of Halakhot of Kriya, just by way of introduction, comments that we make every year, which is that what is the purpose of the Kinot? And I'm going to be drawing very much over the course of the morning on perhaps one of the pioneers of understanding what the Kinot are about, and that was Rav Soloveitchik. For many generations, people just opened the Kinot book at the end of the Chazar Tashatz and started from the first Kinah and read through till the end of the final Kinah, and that was it. And perhaps there was a numbing sense of loss and lack of understanding about what had happened to Am Yisrael and the Jewish people. But there wasn't necessarily a deep understanding of what was going on with the Kinot. And there's a whole question as to why is it permissible even to learn Devarim Hara'im on Tisha B'Av. There's a prohibition against Talmud Torah. The Gemara in Masechet Moed Katan learns out from the fact the pasuk says, Torah Hashem Tumima, Meshivat Nafesh, and Eidut Hashem Ne'emana, Samchei Lev, that the words of the Torah, they excite us, they make us happy. So if the Heftzah of Torah is something which makes us happy, how bichlal can we learn Torah on Tisha B'Av? Rav Soloveitchik explains that in actual fact, learning Devarim Hara'im, learning about the sad things in Jewish law and Jewish history, is a kiyum in the day of Tisha B'Av. We've got a halakha with regard to tefillah. With regard to tefillah, if I don't understand the tefillah, if I don't understand every word, it's still a valid tefillah. Of course, it's ideal that when I say the Amidah, I should understand every word that I'm saying. But if I don't, and my heart is in the right place, so then that's still a valid tefillah. And unfortunately, that's probably a reality of much of tefillah for us, that we don't understand every word. Nevertheless, our kavanot are towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore we're able to fulfill our obligation there. On Tisha B'Av, though, with the Kinot, it's a different consideration. The Kinot aren't tefillah. Each of the Kinot perhaps finishes with a tefillah that the Beit HaMikdash should be restored and that we should be comforted. But essentially, the Kinot are dirges which are supposed to inspire us and make us sad and make us feel about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And if we don't understand them, then we haven't accomplished what we set out to achieve. And therefore, the reason why we're allowed to learn Devarim Hara'im is it's not just a heta in Talmud Torah on Tisha B'Av. It's not just, really I'd like to learn Daf Yomi today, but I'm not allowed to learn Daf Yomi. So I'll learn Perek Edu Megalchim, or I'll learn the Agadatas from Masechet Gittin about the Churban HaBayit. No, it's that so I should have a proper and full understanding of what Tisha B'Av is about, that I have to learn these things so that I should feel the nature of the day. So when the Kinot were written, presumably it was at the time when these spoke to people understood the language of the Kinot, people were able to understand the allusions in the Kinot, and we're going to speak a little bit about that later during the course of the morning. But in recent generations, perhaps many generations, that's been lost on us. And certainly Rav Soloveitchik was a pioneer in the understanding of the Kinot. In Brooklyn, he used to sit down and spend the entire day at Maimonides and explaining themes in the Kinot. not necessarily learning through or reading every single Kinah. I think they did, but point was focusing on the themes. In recent years, Rabbi J.J. Schachter has expanded on this through YU and through other organizations. Also, I always find inspiration in my own late father, Alav Shalom, his study of the Kinot. I have at home his Kinot book, and he has a list at the front of each year, each Kinah, what he would study, and a different year would be studying a different Kinah so that it would bring meaning to it. What we're going to do during the course of the morning is we're going to start off with a short share on a theme in Halakhot of Kriya, and then we're going to look at various other themes as we go through the Kinot. So I want to start off this year learning the Halakhot of Kriya. Kriya is not strictly speaking part of Halakhot of Kriya. In actual fact, the Poskim say that Kriya l'chut v'Aveilut l'chut. Some of the halakhic principles which apply to Kriya don't apply to Aveilut, and vice versa. Kriya is known as the tearing of the clothing of the Avel. So I have a little play on words, because I think it's apt, that I mentioned last night, that in Megillat Eicha we have the pasuk Kara Alei Moed. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu has proclaimed the Moed for me. That's Kara with an Aleph. Kara with an ayin is to tear something. Kara Alei Moed. And on this Moed, we're going to be thinking about the din of Kriya, the din not of making a proclamation, but a din of tearing. And of course, the whole notion of Kriya, this isn't discussed so much by the Poskim and in the sources, but perhaps it's something that should be self-evident. The whole notion of Kriya is that sense of feeling that we are being torn apart, just as the beged, the clothing of the Avel, is torn apart. So also we have the sense that we are being torn apart. Our lives have been torn apart. The fabric of Jewish statehood has been torn apart. And unfortunately, as I mentioned last night, we have this sense now with Medinat Israel that Medinat Israel is being torn apart in a certain sense. And that's really what we want to try and identify with today and try and address. So the Gemara in Masechet Moed Katan on Daf Tet Vav Amud Aleph tells us that Avel Chayav B'Kriya, that a mourner has to tear his clothes. The Ka'amar Lehu Rachmana Livnei Aharon. Now we find a model for this in Chumash, in Sefer Vayikra Perek Yud, where after the death of Nadav and Avihu, so Aaron and his remaining sons, they were told that you shouldn't have your clothes torn apart. So miklal d'chulei alma michayve. We can infer from that everybody else has a chiyuv of tearing their clothes apart. The fact that Bnei Aaron were told not to mourn, because this was at the time of the consecration of the Beit HaMikdash, of the Mishkan, they were told not to mourn, and they were told not to do certain things. So we infer from that that the things that they were told, the observances of mourning they were told not to observe, that in general have to be observed. And Amar Rav Tachlifa bar Abimi Amar Shmuel, this is a Gemara in Daf Kaf Daled Amud Aleph, Avel shelo parav shelo pireim, an Avel who hasn't torn his clothes, chayav mita. Then in actual fact, he's chayav mita, because the pasuk says, "Roshechem al tifrau, v'ktechem lo tifrau." Tifromu, you shouldn't let your hair grow long, and you shouldn't tear your clothes, lo tamutu, so that you don't die. Ha'acher shelo parav shelo pireim chayav mita. So we infer from that somebody else who didn't let their hair grow long, which is of course one of the Tziyun of Aveilut, somebody else who didn't tear their clothes, is going to be chayav mita. Now from these psukim, from these gemaras, and from these psukim, it would seem that the din of Kriya is a din d'oraita. It's from the Torah. But in actual fact, we find that there's a discussion in the Rishonim about that. If we look in the Torah Ta'adam of the Ramban, we find that he is of the opinion that it's not d'oraita. The Ramban is perhaps the most important of the Rishonim on Halakhot of Kriya. The Ramban wrote a very long essay composition called Torah Adam, and he deals with all aspects of Avilut, starting from when a person falls ill, which is perhaps a bit of an unfortunate way to start Halakhot of Kriya, but starts with when a person becomes ill, through to the Halakhot of Kriya and Aninut, and then at the end discusses also the Halakhot of Avilut Yishana, which is what we're observing today, Avilut for the Beit HaMikdash as well. So the Ramban says, it doesn't make sense to me that Kriya should be from the Torah. Rather, it must be that Kriya is Midrabanan. Doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that you have to tear your clothes. In actual fact, it's just we derive it from the fact that Bnei Aaron were told they mustn't tear their clothes. It's brought us an asmachta from the fact that Bnei Aaron were told they don't tear their clothes. We infer that everybody else is chayav. It's clearly an asmachta. The fact that Bnei Aaron were told they mustn't do this, all it tells us really is that everybody else is allowed to do this. That if somebody else feels that motivated by this loss, that they want to tear their clothes as a sign of mourning, then they're allowed to do so, and Bnei Aaron aren't allowed to do so. So it's an asmachta. So then we've got the question, if that's the case, how can we say chayav mita? You can't just say somebody's chayav mita if they're not really. That's also a asmachta. This is a punishment midivrei sofrim, meaning of rabbinic in nature. Doesn't mean to say that Beit Din put you to death, but it means that we've got a notion that anybody who transgresses the words of the Chachamim is chayav mita. We can't just be cavalier with the dinim of the Chachamim. So that's the view of the Ramban and the view of most Rishonim that Kriya is D'Rabbanan. The Rosh brings the view of the Ravid that, in actual fact, it's, as it says, that the Psukim and the Gemara indicate that it's Doraita and that it is Doraita. So we've got a machloket in the Rishonim where the Kriya is Doraita or D'Rabbanan. Most Rishonim paskin that it's D'Rabbanan, and of course that's got halachic implications because we always say suffix D'Rabbanan lekula. Now, what I want to do is discuss a number of details about the dinim of Kriya. And the first is, when should Kriya be taught? So the Gemara in Moed Katam, Kaf Dalet Amud Aleph says, Amar Shmuel, Kol Kera She'ena Ba'ashat Chimum Eino Kera. That the Kriya has to be done with Shat Chimum, when a person feels anguished about what has happened. And if that's not done when the person feels anguish, then it's not a valid Kriya. So you can't. It's not a valid Kriya if it's done 2-3 days after the Patira, and a person is already feeling less anguished about what has happened. So we've got a number of opinions in the Poskim and the Rishonim when Kriya should be done. The Shulchan Aruch and Siman Shin Tet in Yoredeh says, Omrim Tziduk Hadin in Tziat Neshama. When a person dies, then the people who are there say Tziduk Hadin. Ukshemagia leDayan Haemet. And then when you reach the phrase Dayan Haemet, Tziduk Hadin is what we say. We usually say it at a levaya. That's the main part of the service at a funeral. And one of the lines has Baruch Dayan Haemet. When you reach that stage, Korea Ha'avel, the Avel does Kriya. But sometimes that's not possible to do it at the time of Yetziat Neshama. Sometimes the Krovim aren't present when the person dies, or it could be that it's on a Shabbat, and you're not allowed to do Kriya on Shabbat. The Gemara Masechet Shabbat discusses why you can't do Kriya on Shabbat. This is the it should be permitted because it's makalkal, it's something which is destructive. Nevertheless, in actual fact, in this context, it's constructive because it's fulfilling a mitzvah, and it's reflecting the way you feel inside you. So what if you're not there when at the time when it should actually be done? So the Beit Yosef brings down the smack, Misha Meidon Meit, Sarech Likroa Kodem Sheyiston Pnei Hamet. That if you lose a relative, Kriya should be done before either before the coffin is closed, or certainly before the coffin is put into the ground. So in actual fact, our minhag is, generally speaking, that Kriya is done at the Levaya. And one of the reasons for this is brought down in the Achronim. The Gesher HaChaim explains this is because there are various dinim about Kriya. Not everybody knows how to do it properly, and therefore the Chavra Kadisha will supervise this and make sure that it's done properly. Now, what if it's for whatever reason an Avel doesn't do Kriya? Sometimes it happens. I've had it on many occasions when I've been officiating at a Levaya, not usually from our community, but the Avelim say, you know what, I don't want to do Kriya. For whatever reason, they don't want to do it. They feel they're not so frum, or they feel that their father wasn't so frum, or it's alien to them, or they're wearing their best suit, or whatever it is, and they don't want to take Kriya. And then during the week of Shiva, they have a change of heart, and they realize that, in actual fact, they're engaging very much with the Dinim of Avelut, and they find that Jewish religious practices that were so alien to them are actually very supportive to them. And they decide in the middle of Shiva they want to tear Kriya. So is that a valid Kriya or not? So look at the Gemara on Daf Kaf. The Gemara says, "V'atani isi avoad Rabbi Zeira, v'amei la'achvad Rabbi Zeira, kamad Rabbi Zeira. Misha eino chaluk likroa." Person who hasn't got something to tear Kriya on for whatever reason, and they are able to tear Kriya during Shiva, then they should do so. Lachar Shiva eino korea. But after Shiva, they don't do Kriya. Ani Rabbi Zeira Batre, so Rabbi Zeira responded, this applies to the 5 relatives other than parents. So if a person's sitting Shiva for a spouse, or for a sibling, or for a child, so then they can do Kriya during Shiva, but if they haven't done it during Shiva, then they can't do it after Shiva. But for parents, you do Kriya beyond that point, and therefore, so when we say that you tear Kriya after Shiva, that's obviously talking about for parents. Now we've got a machloket in the Rishonim as to for parents how long after Shiva you can still tear Kriya. If we look in the Torah Adam of the Ramban, he gives us 3 opinions. The Ramban says, Pershua Gaonim Zal, Kol Yud Beit Kodesh. So according to the Gaonim, because there's a din of Avelut for parents, which lasts for 12 months, so then the Kriya can be performed during the full 12 months. Barav Rambam Zal Katav Kol Shloshim Yom. The Rambam holds that it's for Shloshim because the din of Avelut is really Shloshim, and it's just for parents. It's an extra. It goes on to the elder 12 months. That's midin kibbud avayim, really more than a din of Avelut. Halakhot Omer Kriya L'olam. In actual fact, you do Kriya forever. Umistavra Kriya L'olam, and it would seem that in actual fact, for parents, you do Kriya forever. And that's how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. For other relatives, so if you didn't hear about the death till after Shloshim, you don't do Kriya. Sometimes it happens, it's very rare nowadays, but in the olden days, it used to happen, a person has a relative abroad, so they would die, and there wasn't WhatsApp or even telephone, so it was difficult to communicate the message, and you didn't necessarily tell your relatives, or the relatives didn't find out necessarily until after 30 days had passed. So if that's the case, then there's no din of Avelut. There's just what we call sha'achat. You sit down, you take off your shoes, sit down on the floor for a few moments, and then that's it. So as I say, it's not very common nowadays, but in the old days, that used to be the case. My late grandfather, he had brothers in Eretz Israel, and he lived in this country. His brothers died in the early 1970s. His family in Eretz Israel, they didn't have a phone, and there were people coming backwards and forwards from a little village outside Rehovot in the 1970s. They only told him after the Shloshim was over, so that he didn't have to observe a full week of Shiva. So in that case, it was after the Shloshim. There's no din of Kriya. But for parents, you do Kriya forever. So this would be an interesting question to come up sometimes. Sometimes the person might say, my father died 20 years ago, and we weren't very frum at the time, and we decided we didn't want to do Kriya. But now I sat in a shir on Tisha B'Av, and I discovered that there's a din of Kriya. That's should I do Kriya now? And the answer would be yes. The kiyum of Kriya for parents is forever. Okay. Now there are a lot of dinim, a lot of details to do with Kriya, and the Gemara lists them. So let's run through the Gemara. Because very often I've seen I've been to a shiva, I've been to a Rabbi, and I've seen people who've done Kriya and they haven't done it in the proper way. So our Kolamite, we've got a number of differences. It's very significant difference between Kriya for parents and Kriya for Shar Krovim, for other relatives. In actual fact, we'll see there are, I think, 11 differences between the way you tear Kriya after the death of parents and the way you tear Kriya after the death of other relatives. So the Gemara says, in general, when you tear Kriya, you tear just a tefach. For parents, you have to tear, he says, about 3 tefachim. You have to tear the garment so much that it will reach down to your heart. Okay, not just a fist breadth, but a tefach. Generally speaking, when you tear Kriya, you only, however many layers you're wearing, you only tear the upper layer. But for parents, you tear everything that you're wearing. That's we say until your chest is uncovered. And then then there's a question what about the other. We say the afikra sutor. There's a question what this is. We say you don't need to tear that. So that's a question. We'll see. We'll touch on it in a bit. Whether it means your undershirt, your vest, or whether it means your jacket. Echad ha'ish, v'echad ha'isha. Dinim of Kriya apply both to men and to women. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer ha'isha korat ha'tachton machazirto la'achoreha v'chozeret korat ha'elyon. A woman tears her undershirt and then turns it round so that the tear is at the back and it can't be seen. And then she turns the shirt that's on top of it so that her chest isn't uncovered. For all relatives, that's if you don't want to tear through the hem of the garment, you don't have to. But for parents, you do. Sometimes you see they just do a kriya, they take a knife and they just tear a tefach there. So if it's for Shar Krovim, then it's valid. If for parents, it has to tear through the hem of the garment. But in actual fact, we say even for everybody that it has to tear right through the hem. Rabbi Yehuda it's not a proper kriya at all. And how do we know that? Because we've got a pasuk by Chazek Gadav by Kraim Shnaim Kraim that he took hold of his garment and he tore it into two parts. So therefore, it always has to be tearing through the hem of the garment. So for all relatives, you can loosely tack up the kriya after shloshim and after shiva and properly fix it after shloshim. But for parents, you can never properly fix it, and you can only tack it up after the shloshim. Again, in olden times, nowadays, person does kriya on the shirt, and then after shiva, they throw it in the bin. In olden days, that wasn't the case. You perhaps only had 2 or 3 shirts, so you wanted to repair it so you could carry on wearing it. על כל המתים רצה קורא ביד, רצה קורא בכלי, על האביב ועל אמו ביד. For all other relatives, Kriya can be done either by hand or by using a pair of scissors, but for parents it has to be done by hand. And finally, על כל המתים כולן מבפנים, על האביב ועל אמו קורא מבחוץ. For all other relatives, it's done bifnim, inside. We'll see what that means. But for parents, it's done on the outside. So we're not going to go through all the details that we've got here on the pages in front of us, but just to focus on a couple of them. So source number 4, we said the Shiur HaKriya. So we said for all other relatives, it's a tefach. And for parents, it's ad shemagal libor, until your chest is visible. If you look in the Shach says adds a further detail. It's a detail which everybody seems to know. They don't necessarily know all the din in the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch, but know the din of the Shach. Katav ma'ashal d'negin darav va'im b'karim mitzad samol, v'al kol shakrovim k'gombanav ve'echav mitzad yamin. So for parents, you do Kriya on the left-hand side, because that's where your heart is supposedly. And for other relatives, you do it over the right-hand side. It makes sense that you would do it over the right-hand side. Generally speaking, we give the right-hand side precedence in Halakha. So our default position would be that you do Kriya on the right-hand side. But as far as this is concerned, we do, except for parents where it's over the left-hand side. I do remember one time I was in Levaya, where somebody said to me their heart was on the right-hand side, and they wanted to know which side they should do Kriya on. So now we've got the question of which begadim should you do Kriya on, and we said, this is number 5, apar kesuto eina ma'akevet. The apar case you don't need to do Kriya on that. So the question is, what is this apar kesuto? So we've got a machloket. If we look in the Torah, so the Torah says in the middle of that, it brings the Rosh. Oh, sorry, the apar kesuto. Perish Rashi, shu sudash al rosho b'nofal al panav. The fisha eno malbush ein tzarich l'koro. So what's this apar kesuto? It's like some sort of kafia, that's an Arab headdress that's wrapped around your head and falls down in front of you. So it's sort of it's some sort of article of clothing, but it doesn't really, it's not really a malbush, and therefore you don't need to Kriya on that. Ubal ha'aruch perishu lavusha tachto, upatuach biktefav, kshulo shod koshro, lefi she'eno sin oto lilbosh el lekabel hazeya eino ma'akev ha'kriya. But the aruch, one of the Italian Rishonim, he says that apar kesuto is actually a vest. It's it's an undergarment that is there just to absorb the sweat. So now we've got a machloket in the Rishonim, essentially, whether you need to do Kriya even on your undergarment, even on your vest. According to the Aruch, you don't, whereas according to Rashi, you would. Rashi says the only thing that you don't need to do Kriya on is the kafia, because that's not really a beged. Whereas the undershirt is a beged. Whereas the Aruch says you don't need to do on the undershirt, because even though it's a beged, it's there only to absorb the sweat, and there's no kavod associated with it at all. Then there's a third opinion what the apar kesuto is, and that's the Beit Yosef brings the smug, and that's the matrona. So what's the matrona? It's sudar ha'elyon she'eno elo litzniut. It's a sudar ha'elyon. It's an outer cloak which is only worn for tzniut. Tzniut doesn't mean to say the conventional understanding of tznius, but tzniut means sort of dignity. It seems that the poskim talk about something which is called a shul mantle. That's the choshev people in shul. They would have a gown that they would put on when they come into shul to cover their clothes. Perhaps their clothes were a bit dirty from work or whatever. They were important people, and that's what they would wear in shul. So that doesn't need Kriya. So let's see what the Shulchan Aruch says. The Shulchan Aruch says, "Apar kesuto mutzarich likroa. Yesh mefarshin shu beged hazeh hadavuk b'psaro. Yesh mefarshin dahaim beged ha'elyon shekorin kappa." So some say that this is the vest, and some say that it's your outer garment. So the minhag is that you never tear the kappa, the outer garment, even for parents. And for parents, you also tear the chemise. A chemise is a shirt, obviously. And then the Rama says, the Rama says actually our minhag is a bit different. And he says we don't tear the vest, nor the outer cloak. Everything else you tear for parents. You just wear your outer garment, but underneath the sarbal. So we won't go through there's a long taz here. But again, the stuff that we're not going through together, people might want to look at in their own time, or this afternoon or whatever. The Taz discusses, the question is, what is this outer garment that you don't need to do Kriya on? And this really boils down to the question of whether you do Kriya on a jacket. When a person's sitting in Shiva, do they do Kriya on a jacket? They definitely do Kriya on a shirt, but do you do Kriya on a jacket? So the Taz basically says it depends whether a jacket is worn just for tzniut ba'alma, for kavod, or whether it's a functional garment. And it says that something which is not worn in the house, then you don't do Kriya on. Something that you wear in the house, you do Kriya on. So there might well be a change in a societal change about a jacket. Nowadays, who wears jackets indoors? Only from people for davening. And therefore, maybe a jacket doesn't need Kriya. If it doesn't need Kriya, then certainly for Shar Meitim, if you were to do Kriya on a jacket, then you wouldn't actually fulfill the mitzvah, because this is not a beggar that needs Kriya. On the other hand, if we say jacket, sometimes people do wear jackets indoors, and therefore it does need Kriya. Then one would be Yotzei for Shar Meitim with the jacket. So I suppose it depends on how you wear a jacket. If you only put on a jacket, the only time you wear a jacket is Shabbat morning when you go out of the house to shul. You put your jacket on for shul, and then you take it back when you come back from shul. You don't wear it any other time. It would seem that for Kriya you wouldn't tear Kriya for it. As far as women are concerned, both men and women have to do Kriya. As we said, the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch talk about that a woman turns round her clothing, so that she sort of wears it backwards, so that the torn part isn't visible. So the Aruch HaShulchan explains that was presumably talking about an olden type of clothing, where you could do that. But with modern clothing, if a woman were to wear her blouse backwards, then it would be very strange. But it would seem that perhaps a woman wears a blouse and a t-shirt, so she should do Kriya on her t-shirt, then turn it backwards and just wear it backwards, and then the Kriya will be at the back, and then do Kriya on her blouse, and she won't have exposed herself. So where should the Kriya be done on the beggar? This is number 7. The Kriya should be done, Shulchan Aruch says, so this was the Shulchan Aruch said that for other relatives you don't need to tear through the hem of the garment, but for parents you do. And the Rama says also for other relatives you need to tear through the safa, the Chen Noagin, and that is the minhag as well. That's how we do it. Source number 8, we've got this notion of we said in the Gemara that for Shar Meitim you do it bifnim on the inside, and for Avva'im you do it mibachutz. So what does it mean bifnim mibachutz? If you look at the Torah, this brings Rashi mibifnim b'cheder, and mibachutz is bifnei ha'am. So for other relatives you do the Kriya privately, and for parents you do it bifnei ha'am, publicly in front of everybody. Means machnis yado tachat chaluko v'koro. But it means no, you do it again. It's more privately. You sort of, if it's the under, if you're doing your shirt and you're not doing your coat, so then you sort of, just do it, under the garment like that, rather than exposing it to everybody. How does the Shulchan Aruch paskin? כל המתים יש לקרוא בפנים, שלא בפני אדם, לפיכך יש לו להכניס ידו בפנים וקורא בצנעה. So he combines the two opinions, but certainly says, as far as other relatives, you do it privately. In the presence of everybody else. So when I'm at a levaya, and I'm in charge of the Kriya, always make sure for the Shakrovim, the siblings, spouse of the person who's died, we generally do the Kriya before everybody comes into the Ohel, and then as everybody's coming into the Ohel, let's do the Kriya on the children of the Niftar. So it should be Bifnei Kol Ha'am. There is, as we said, for parents, it needs to be done by Yad, and for Shakov it can be done by a Kli. So very often it comes up, if you've got modern clothing, it's very difficult to get through the seam of the garment without starting off with the Kli. So you can start off by using a pair of scissors or a knife to cut through the hem of the garment, but then you have to tear the rest by hand. And but for Shakrovim, that's not the din. You can cut the whole thing with a pair of scissors. There's a question as to who should do the Kriya, whether it's the Avel themselves or whether it should be somebody else. We see here a Machloket, the Pitkei Tshuva in source 9 says that Katapari Kol Kriya Tov Shetiyeh Al Yidei Acher Demitbayesh Mimenu Ve'ika Admat Nafesh Tfei. In actual fact, you should have somebody else do the Kriya for you, because then you feel more humbled by that. The fact that somebody is coming and tearing your clothes, that's a very humiliating procedure, and you feel that this is something being imposed upon you by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's how the Aruch HaShulchan says. In actual fact, no, it's a thing you need to do Kriya yourself, and therefore it applies to you. You should do the Kriya yourself. Moving on from Kriya for Avelim, we find in a couple of cases where even where a person's not an Avel, there's a din of Kriya. So one din is that anybody who's present, when a person dies, if you're present when a person dies, there's a din that you have to tear Kriya. And then there's a question whether it's an Adam Kasher or only for an Adam Kasher, or if it's for anybody. The Maisa, we paskin that it should be for anybody, unless you know that they're a real Rasha, then you would tear Kriya when they pass away. So the question comes up, there was a situation arose that it used to be the minhag that if the person was on their deathbed, the Chevra Kadisha would be called to be there with the person while they're on their deathbed, so they should pass away with the minyan. But the Chevra Kadisha became reluctant to do that, because every time they were called out to be with somebody on the deathbed, there goes another shirt. So they were talking that professionals don't need to do that. In actual fact, there's a question about doctors. If a doctor is present at a Yetziat Neshama, do they have to do Ter Kriya? So a chiluk is made whether it's their own clothing or whether it's hospital clothing. If it's hospital clothing, it's not their clothing to do Kriya on. If it's their own, they do. The minhag is brought down that you just do a small Kriya, the Shulei HaBeged. You don't need to tear, if it's a one-off, you're Yetziat Neshama. Let's say for a grandparent or an in-law or something like that, or a very close friend, then I think one should do Kriya. If you're a doctor or a Chevra Kadisha or a rabbi and you're frequently present for that, then you should do Kriya b'shulei haBeged at the bottom of the beged where it's tucked into your clothing, so nobody necessarily sees that. I want to conclude this part of the shir by looking at tying this all in now with Tisha B'Av and the Churban HaBayit. We've spoken about Kriya for Avelut, but there's also Kriya for Churban HaBayit. If we look in the, we'll look in the Shulchan Aruch. Of course, this comes up in Gemara as well. We'll look at this in the Shulchan Aruch. In Aruch Chaim, The Shulchan Aruch says in Tafkuf Samach Aleph, Haroeh Arei Yehuda b'churbanan. Person who sees the cities of Judah in a destroyed state, Omer Ir Kodshech Arei Kodshech Hayu Midbar, says the pasuk, the city, your holy cities have become a wilderness. The Korea, and then you tear Kriya. So when you stand and you see the cities of Judah destroyed, you tear Kriya. Haroeh Yerushalayim b'churbanan, and when you see Jerusalem in a destroyed state, Omer Tzion hayata midbar shmama, that Tzion has become a desolate desert. The Korea, and you do Kriya. Beit Hamikdash Omer, and when you see the Beit Hamikdash, you say Beit Kodshenu Tifartenu Asher Lucha Votenu Haya Lisreifat Eish V'Chol Machmadenu Haya L'Chorba, that our holy building and our glory, in which our forefathers praised you, has become burned by fire. And our desire has been, our point of focus of desire has become destroyed. And the Korea, and you tear Kriya. And goes on to discuss all the dinim of the Kriya for going to the Yerushalayim and the Beit HaMikdash. Now this is something which is, of course, very counterintuitive for us. We all feel great simcha when we go to the Kotel HaMaravi. Who goes to the Kotel HaMaravi and doesn't feel this sense of pride, this sense of joy? So many of us have danced at the Kotel HaMaravi. This is, where, our ancestors, yearned to be able to go, and were never able to go there. And we're able to go there. Who wants to tear Kriya? And even if you think about it, so you look back at pictures of the Kotel in the 1920s. People you can find on the internet, pictures of the Kotel in the 1920s. It was a very small area in front of the Kotel, and it was very cramped. And you really had to sense that this was just one wall. This is all that's been left to us. We're not in charge of it. Certainly during the time of the British Mandate, there were strict rules about what could be done at the Kotel. Rabbi Levine, in the book Tzaddik in Our Time, he describes how every year on Motzei Yom Kippur there would be somebody brought to the British prison. This was and would be welcomed as a hero. This was the person who blew shofar at the Kotel on Motzei Yom Kippur, because that was outlawed by the British during the times of the Mandate. So you have this sense that this is just a remnant of the Beit HaMikdash. We have nothing left. Nowadays, you go to you compare the Kotel today and the plaza there with what it was 100 years ago. Who can feel anything but pride? Who wants to tear Kriya when you go to the Kotel? And besides that, it's a day in Yerushalayim. Once upon a time, maybe there was a sense you go to Yerushalayim, you have this sense, I'm visiting a site of destruction. Nowadays, you go to Yerushalayim, and it's, this is the highlight of your trip to Israel. Yeah, okay, you're by the Dead Sea and you're in Tel Aviv and everything, but the highlight is they will go to Yerushalayim, start off at the Kotel, then you go and buy some kibbutz there, and finish off with ice cream. You don't want to go around the whole day with a beged karua. It doesn't feel right. So this is something which the poskim have discussed a bit. So Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva in the final volume of Igrot Moshe, where he talks about, this makes a distinction between Arei Yehuda and the Kotel. And he says the Arei Yehuda in Yerushalayim itself, it's Tachat Mamshelet Yisrael now. It's under Jewish sovereignty, and therefore you don't have to tear Kriya. However, for the Kotel, one still does have to tear Kriya. In actual fact, Rav Zevin, in his work, Hamodim B'Halakha, he's got a perek on this, and he says, uses this line that, but now that Yerushalayim is Tachat Memshelet Yisrael, Ashreinu Shezachinu Lekach, happy are we that we've merited this, so we don't dare Kriya for going to for Yerushalayim. In the English translation, they've taken out Ashreinu Shezachinu Lekach, that we are lucky that this has happened. very strange that was taken out. In any event, so that's what Rav Moshe says. However, there is many people don't tear Kriya when they go to the Kotel. Rav Chaim David Halevi, who was the Sephardi chief rabbi of Tel Aviv through the 1970s, 1980s, he quotes Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who says that nowadays you don't need to tear Kriya on the for the Beit HaMikdash. He says, "Avan Kfar Zakei B'Chokhmah Agon Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook Shlita." Passed away now. Liftob is mining Mikra Makom HaMikdash. Ta'amo shel ha'avelut ha'amitit al Beit HaMikdash. Ibiglal Yad HaGoyim sholetet bo. It's a good question. Why do you have to tear Kriya on the Makom HaMikdash? Is it because the Beit HaMikdash has been destroyed, or is it because that we're not in charge of the Temple Mount? And he says it's because we're not in charge of the Temple Mount. Nowadays, we're in charge of the Temple Mount. Coming Yishbo Miskad, even though there's a mosque there. The reason why we haven't built the Beit HaMikdash, there's no legal impediment to us rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash. It could be Hilchatiyim and Politiyim. It's for halachic reasons, political reasons that we haven't rebuilt the Beit HaMikdash. But from a legal perspective, I don't know what the international outcry would be, but from a legal perspective, we can go to Yerushalayim today and rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. And therefore, Rav Tzvi Yehuda was of the opinion that one doesn't need to tear Kriya when one goes to the Makom HaMikdash. Rav Melamed in Peninei Halacha also has a chapter on this. He says that many people have the minhag not to tear Kriya when they go to the Beit HaMikdash. A number, combining a number of factors. He says one of the shittot is that you only tear Kriya if you see the ground where the Beit HaMikdash is supposed to stand. And that you can't see unless you go up onto Har HaBayit, and we don't go up onto Har HaBayit. So therefore, you don't need to tear Kriya. Some people swap their clothes with others so that you're not wearing your own clothes. Others say if you go on a day when there's no Tachanun, you don't need to tear Kriya. I saw a suggestion somewhere online recently. It's in the forum of the Osha Chochmah. Somebody suggested setting up a gemach near the Kotel of spare shirts, so that you can borrow a shirt when you go to the Kotel and tear Kriya on that shirt. Personally, I think that it is right to tear Kriya when one goes to the Kotel from time to time. At the end of the day, we need to feel that this is the Kotel is not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is that we should have the Beit HaMikdash back, and all we have is a remnant of what there is. And when I've got a shirt that's past its expiry date, instead of throwing it out, I put it aside, and next time I'm at the Kotel, I tear Kriya on that shirt, and then I go into the bathroom to change my shirt, so that when I'm davening at the Kotel, I'm wearing a shirt which is mechubad, because at the end of the day, this is a time of a great pride for us to be in front of the Kotel Hamaravi. So those are the words of introduction. But we should have this sense on Tisha B'Av, and let's try and engage a little bit with the events of Tisha B'Av, and just stop for a moment and think. Kriya is a very traumatic. Anybody who's done Kriya, for a relative, will realize this is a very traumatic thing to do. You hear the beged being torn. There's silence around. You hear this tearing of the beged, and it gives you this sense that your world has been torn apart with this relative that you've lost. That's how you're supposed to feel. That's how we should feel with the Churban HaBayit as well. That everything's just fallen apart. Jewish sovereignty's fallen apart. Jewish homelands has fallen apart. Jewish security has fallen apart. And our relationship, our closeness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu has fallen apart. And that's what the Kriya represents, and that's what, of course, we're mourning on Tisha B'Av. We're going to start in just a moment reading the first of the Kinot. Nobody should feel they have to stay here for the whole morning. I know people have got other commitments, and it's not that it's statutory to say parts of these particular parts of the tefillah. If people want at 10:30 to go outside and finish off the tefillah, Ashrei, and Tzion, Ashrei, and Kaddish, then please feel free to do so. We're going to start now with the first of the Kinot, which is Shabbat Suru Meni, which is on page 91 in the Rosenfeld, 152 in the Archgold, and 195 in the Koren. In actual fact, this is half a Kinot. It's the second half of a Kinot. It's Shabbat Suru. You can see that there's an acrostic here that begins with the Suru, the Samach. Then the next verse is the Ayin. Next verse is the Pei. Where's all the letters up to Samach? So that was in Chazar Tashatz. We don't say Krovets or Krovot. So if you look in the Rosenfeld, it's actually got the Krovot in the Chazar Tashatz. Extra bits which are put in. And this was a Kinah which was started off in Chazar Tashatz, and now we're finishing it off. This is one of the Kinot of Eliezer HaKaleh. He is perhaps the most important of the Paitanim. I think we've probably spoken about him a little bit in the past. It's unclear when he lived. Most scholars think that he lived around about the 6th or the 7th centuries. Others think that perhaps he was even a Tana who lived in Eretz Israel at the time of the 2nd century. Certainly very, very old. So we presume that he's very old because he wrote many of the Piyutim that we say or don't say any longer on the Chagim. He's got no Piyutim for second day Yom Tov, including for second day Rosh Hashanah. No Piyutim for second day Rosh Hashanah. So it's seen that he lived in a time when there was no second day Rosh Hashanah, even in Eretz Israel. So in Eretz Israel, they've been keeping second day Rosh Hashanah certainly since Talmudic times. So that would indicate that he was very, very possibly a Tana, that he had no Piyutim for the second day of Rosh Hashanah. So we're not going to discuss this Piyut in detail, but it is one of the Piyutim of the Kaleh, which, like so many of them, follows an acrostic of the Aleph Bet, which is the case in Megillat Eicha.
For parents to cut off stitches.
Now, there's a tube of the Tzitz Eliezer, which says that you don't cut tzitzit. Yeah.
Shabbat Suru Shimini authorized to Maos, testimony, Ebrei Haverai, Sakota Mishkan, Scott to be right, Sakota Bubu, Biborai, Saku Fa, Madu, Ebrai, Kesirat Kol Abirai, Naflaudei Nukusur, Tukuya, Eki Hikta, the Chazon Ben Brachia, Adukil Ei Gilgal, Chabuya, Imi Molelet, Bibanit Nukuya, Asavanicham, Vikra Labetia, Benam Aleina Anipokia, Lepene Purpura, Nutsu Chasidea, Palkesu, Safra, Karu Yusodeha, Tachat Peit Shido, Tachat Sodeha, Patsu Chazireya, Aye Chasideha, Patsu Mase, Erba Lenideha, Perishat Tzion, Viyadeha, Ahar Tzadu, Shonei B'danai, Tzaku Roshi Zegonai, Samtu Beno, Amod Zegonai, So the Natsarta, the Orer Mad, the Danai, Tzak Ami, Benedinai, Tzadiku Adonai, Adakali Nikif Padetan, Medi Ermuni, Kerafta Elai, Vayacharimuni, Karata Yoshbe Gibon, Odheim Zermuni, Kolilashmia Bara, Hirkimuni, Kumi Avori, Batel Herimuni, Karata Mahavai, Himarimuni, Lamaruach Hapenu, Letevach Shamaru, Raita kitanu oreinu chamaru, Raita ki amal v'chas be'imuyecha gamaru, Rata v'yad yecheskel v'yikom komo maru, Rei v'nachidein nigoi amaru, Rei Adonai ki tzari me'ai yechomar maru. Ashirenu sisi shima legoi tzeani, shivtana rumos chatzerai, lahat kieni, shivtei meshorei devir, domenu lahat eini, shamat azmarot, af hechin letateni, shachu v'nagu chatzatz, lahavireini, shamu ki me'enacha ani. כי תמחקת בחייס אופניך, חשיב להם גמול, כחזות פניך, תרדוף בצלמון, יועצי רע על צפניך, תיתן להב נוצי פניך, תקרא לשקרם כוס, כמוס בפניך, תבוא כל רעתם לפניך, Tavok Elatar Asher Kilanu Limevo Chamat B'chema Nihalnu Ad Lachalach B'chavor Higlanu Zaken Vachor V'tula Kabalanu Ram Havena Amacha Kulanu
Zachor Adonai Mehayalanu. Before we move on to the next Kinot, I want to speak a little bit about Eicha. A number of the Kinot open with the word Eicha, unsurprisingly. And what does the word Eicha mean? The word Eicha is a question, Eikor. How can it be like this? How can these events have occurred to the Jewish people? And how can we have brought about a situation where HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to separate himself and depart from us in this way? And usually each year we look at different aspects of Megillat Eicha. So this year I want to look at the third perek of Eicha. And those who were following along last night will know that the third perek of Eicha is quite different to the rest of Eicha in two ways, or at least two ways. First way is that the third perek, the middle perek, has more psukim. I'm not sure this is actually longer. It has more psukim. The other parakim have 22 psukim in them each, for each letter of the alphabet, whereas this perek has 66 psukim because it's in triplets. So each letter of the alphabet has 3 psukim, but they're all small psukim. So it's not significantly longer necessarily than the rest of the parakim. So that's in terms of its structure. And these are a short staccato, if you like, psukim. But more significantly is the content. This perek doesn't discuss the Churban Habayit or Yerushalayim. In actual fact, Megillat Eicha doesn't really talk about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash at all. It talks about the destruction of Yerushalayim and the Aveilut of Yerushalayim. But the third perek doesn't even talk about that in any sense. The third perek is about the human response to tragedy and how we react to the terrible things that are happening in our existence. And I want to draw particularly on Dr. Yael Ziegler's very wonderful book and commentary on Megillat Eicha, published by Magid and Koren, called Lamentations, Faith in a Turbulent World. And that's exactly what this perek is about. It's about, even though Jewish life has been destroyed and all the anchors that we're familiar with have been pulled away, nevertheless, we still have faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And not only that we have faith, but there's an ability to grow even at times of disaster. And if you look, she divides this perek into three parts. She says the first part, Psukim 1 to 18, are a first-person account of the suffering, so how the individual here has suffered. Part 2, verses 21 to 39, are theological reflections. And part 3, again, is a first-person account of suffering. And what she demonstrates is that this is the middle perek of Megillat Eicha, and the middle part of the middle perek, and we're going to focus on the middle psukim of the middle part of the middle perek, right, which are theological reflections and a belief in the value of engaging with the punishment that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has meted out on the Jewish people. So this is the centerpiece of Megillat Eicha. So the third perek begins at, you can glance at Megillat Eicha in your Kinot books, that Megillat Eicha begins, Ani ha-gever ra'a. I am the gever, I am the person, ra'a who has seen affliction, the shevet evrato, with the rod of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's wrath. Now there's discussion in the Mefarshim as to who this gever is. And Dr. Ziegler points out that gever is an interesting term to be used. There are lots of different words in Hebrew for a person, a man, an enosh, an ish, other words as well. Why particularly use the word the gever? So Rashi seems to think that the gever here is referring particularly to Yirmiyahu, but other Mefarshim, and this is the approach that Dr. Ziegler takes, is that it's actually referring to anybody. She says the word gever may offer a clue to the identity of the man in the chapter. Gever is certainly not the most common word used to refer to an adult male in the Bible. Certain synonyms for man include ish, the most common referent, enosh, and adam. While often interchangeable within a sentence, synonymous words tend to retain subtle, distinctive meanings, thereby enriching a language. Etymologically, the word gever relates to gevurah, strength, and may refer to a man who wields physical or military strength. And therefore, perhaps the gever uses this self-description ironically or bitterly, underscoring his abuse and defeat in spite of his physical might. The gever may also refer to someone who has spiritual strength or inner strength, the heroic ability to overcome suffering. Baruch HaGever, no, happy is the gever whom you make suffer God, and you teach him from your instructions. So we're seeing this gever that we're talking about. It's not by chance that we're using the term gever. Two notions with the idea of the word gever. Number one is that it's ironic. It's we think that we're a gever. We think, we thought that it can never happen. The Beit HaMikdash can never be destroyed. This will never happen to Am Yisrael. We are powerful, and then we find that we've fallen. In a historical perspective, this is, and I'm not casting stones or aspersions, but historians say, modern historians say, this is what happened in the years between 1967 and the victory of Milchemet Sheshet Hayamim and the tragedies of 1973, the Yom Kippur War. There was this sense of gevurah that Am Yisrael were almost untouchable. We'd be victorious in 67. Against all the odds, we'd won. There was this sense in Medinat Israel and Eretz Israel of, we're all powerful, and we were overconfident. In 1973, Yom Kippurim, we were caught unawares and suffered terrible losses. So Ani HaGever, me who thought I was so powerful, Ra'a Oni, I've now seen tragedy and destruction and affliction. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's also a sense that in actual fact we can gain gevurah, we can gain power and might from engaging with tragedy, learning the lessons from tragedy, and letting us build us up. In the big paragraph on page 9, that she says, uniquely positioned as a chapter that has no counterpart, this chapter's placement as Eicha's central axis underscores its significance. Chapter 3 is the linchpin of the book, its theological centerpiece. All events revolve around the contemplative center, mirroring the contemplative center that lies at the core of every human being and represents the secrets of human resilience. At the heart of human suffering, human experience, lie conviction, confidence, and courage. Eicha is not merely a book of human suffering, but rather one that allows people to find the deep strain of tranquility within the maelstrom of existence, enabling them to find faith in a turbulent world. And this is so important for us in the context of Eicha, to realize that we can still be a gever, that we can still be powerful. We've had the first 2 chapters, which talk about Eicha Yashva Ba'adat Ha'ira Bat Yam. Look at this city which was once so glorious and its nothingness now. That's, looking at how terrible it is, the first 2 chapters. Then we have this word of this perek of encouragement that we can learn from the experiences and carry on. And then we have chapters 4 and 5, which are telling us, yes, these experiences do carry on, but we can manage to bear them and grow stronger from them with the confidence of engaging with our HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we see in this 3rd chapter. And this is true about, a theme that I've said in previous years and will repeat today, and I think is so true, that Kinot are not just about the Churban Beit HaMikdash. The Kinot, so many of the Kinot, you can take them and you can say, yeah, it was written about the Churban Beit HaMikdash because it can reflect so many experiences in Jewish history. It can reflect events at the times of the Crusades, events in the Middle Ages, events in the pogroms, events in the Shoah, events in the Hebron riots that we discussed a few years ago, etc. All these things that, and we can find in all of these historical tragedies, we can find a chance for hope and an ability to overcome our suffering. So focusing on the central psukim of the central part, the central perek, we've got 4 psukim: Kaf Zayin, Kaf Ket, Kaf Tet, Lamed. Tov la gever ki yisa ol bin urav. So it's good for man that he bear a yoke in his youth. Yeshev badad v'yidom ki natal alav. Let him sit alone and be silent, for he has laid it upon him. Yitain be'afar pihu ulai yesh tikva. Let him put his mouth to the dust. Perhaps there is hope. Yitain l'makehu lechi yispa b'cherpah. Let him give his cheek to him that strikes him. Let him be filled with taunts. The book's central core, the central section of the central chapter, lies a section that she's termed the role of the suffering individual. Its structural centrality indicates its pivotal role in the book. Deep in the recesses of the book lie human tenacity, an abiding faith in the human ability to survive. And this is the point that she makes. Why is it good to bear a burden in one's youth? Perhaps the idea that it is good to suffer only in one's youth when one has the stamina and resilience to tolerate hardship. Yet it seems that the statement maintains a positive outlook towards youthful suffering. Some commentators suggest that because the yoke refers not to abstract suffering but to punishment for sins. Possibly this is because those who are punished for their sins in their youth will be spared later in life. Others regard the suffering youth as a formative experience, one that is instrumental in constructing the human persona. In this schema, it may be good for people to experience adversity early on in order to prepare them to face life's inevitable suffering later when their strength has waned. More positively, individuals who encounter difficulties in their youth acquire courage and build a robust character. They can learn to rely on God and their own inner resources, gaining strength to endure whatever hardships may come their way. I think there's a certain paradox here. The paradox here is it's much easier to comprehend suffering and to learn from it as you grow older. as opposed to when you're young. When you're young, you never understand the real meaning of it. You never fully appreciate the tragedy. You look more at Gevura rather than the messages which are built into it, and you tend to rebel against it, to fight against it, and not really to appreciate and understand its inner meanings. It's only as you grow older, so I appreciate things now that when I was in my 20s, I didn't understand. When you're in the 20s, it's much harder. I know there are people here in their 20s. So it's much harder to fully understand the meaning of human suffering and tragedy and the Churban Habayit, I think, than it is when you've had longer to contemplate it and when you're of an older age. And perhaps what these psukim are trying to do to us is to make us understand that in actual fact we can learn, perhaps even if we're not young any longer, but from the experiences of our youth, to inform us about the future and how we should react with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But it's important what she says at the end of this bit. Calamity need not destroy one's convictions. Serving instead as a conduit to discovering them, adversity can foster faith in a turbulent world. Sometimes we don't even appreciate the turbulence of the world and the conflicting emotions. This is what this parak is telling us. And I suppose at the time of the Churban Habayit, and in every tragedy that's befallen Am Yisrael over the course of history, there's been a tendency to think that the end has come. There's no point in anything. We can't go on. People lose faith. And this is the message of the central psukim of Eicha, is not to lose faith. So we're going to continue now with the second of the Kinot, again written by the Kalir, and it's saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that how could you have done these things to us? You've done these terrible things. Lo zacharta, you've made so many promises to us over the course of Jewish history. How could you forget these promises or the good things that the Jewish people have done over the course of history? And there's a congregational response of Zechor Hashem mehayalanu. We want you, Hashem, to remember what has happened to us. And that's of course a prayer that Lo Zacharta, the things you've forgotten about, please don't forget them and remember the plight of Am Yisrael.
ולא זכרת ברית בין בתרים אשר ביררת לפניך ובכן ביתי
זכור
איך דהרת בדהרתך לגלות יד גאים גדולך ולא זכרת דליקת דרך אשר דילגת להתקלך ובכן דיברת חגדה והגיעך להדופי הגדולים המונך ולא זכרת דילבך פסד אשר בידך ליבודך ובכן וקונן
זכור
איך זנחת בזעמך לזלזל ביתרים זבלך ולא זכרת פליט לחוקי חורב אשר חקקת לחמולך ובכן טיבית איך טרחת וטרחך לשרוף בעצמאים תלך ולא זכרת יקר ידידות יושר אשר ייחדת ליודך ובכן ילדנו איך טיב בנתה בחסך לכלות ביד כל שלי לפניך, ולא זכרת את לזנות לעולם אשר לימדת בכתובך וכן איך מילאת במוסך למחות ביד מונים מנעשיך, ולא זכרת נשיאת נוצת נשר אשר נשאת לנשואיך וכן נהינו. איך חשפת בשרך לסגר ביד שעפים צעדיך, ולא זכרת עוז עדי אלוהים אשר התרת לעבדיך ובכן ענינו. איך חפצת בתחתך לפגר ביד פרסים כלייך, ולא זכרת צהלת צבי צדק אשר צפנת לצבאיך ובכן צעקנו.
זכור
איך קראת בקריאתך לקנות ביד קמין פרעך, ולא זכרת רגע רכב ריבותיים אשר רצית לרעך ובכן רגענו. איך שבת בקריאתך לשאלות יד שולים שלמך, ולא זכרת תוקף כלכלי תואר אשר תטענת לתמימך ובכן תענו.
זכור
לשפוך כמים על מה ביום זה נשפיל פעמיים, זוכרי בהיותי יושבת בשלווה בירושלים, רגעתי
The next of the Kinot that we're going to read is Eichatifarti, which is on page 96 in the Rosenfeld, 166 in the Art Scroll, and 255 in the Koren. And what I want to do before we read it is just think a little bit about the structure of the Kinot, because we read the Kinot and we're trying to engage with them somewhat today, trying to understand what they're about. But really, we're missing so many of the allusions and so many of the nuances in their construction and in the way that they were composed. And we really don't appreciate piyut. I mean, a big question is, we don't really appreciate tefillah. So much of our tefillah we say, and it's just mitzvot hanashim melumata. It's just words that trip off our tongues without understanding them and without really appreciating what the nuances of each word are and why particular words are chosen. It's particularly relevant with regards to piyutim. Piyutim aren't just more paragraphs that are just written and stuffed into the Machzorim or the Kinot books, but these are poems, and very often, the way they're printed. I see a few people who have got the old paperback Kinot books, where each of the Kinot is just printed as one long paragraph, and there's no form to it whatsoever. And the same is true even in the Rosenfeld. Not all of them reflect the way that it was written to be recited. But what I want to show is how every line of the Kinot actually has a particular references to it. It's not just poetry, but it's poetry which is drawing on so many Midrashic and biblical allusions that it's a pity to miss. And I suppose it's a challenge, either you like poetry or you don't like poetry. There are some people, at school when you were learning, doing English, so some people loved poetry and they found prose boring. Other people found prose interesting. Tell me the story. I'm not interested in poetry. One or two of the Kinot are prose and describe things. but by and large, they're poetry. So if you don't write poetry, it's a problem. But let's look at Eichat Yefarti. And on page 8, I've taken just the first 3 verses from it, and I've different of the Kinot books will present them in different ways. Certainly, the way that the Rosenfeld has it doesn't really reflect everything that's going on here. So the first thing to be aware of in this Kinah is that this is a Kinah which is built on the second perek of Eicha. Again, if you just sort of open your Kinot book and read it through, so you won't necessarily pick up on that. But our first our first stanza begins Eicha, the second one Bila, the third one Gadad, the fourth one Darach, the fifth one Haya. Look at the first psukim of Eicha, which I've got at the top of the page. First pasuk of second parak begins with Eicha. Second pasuk begins with Bila. Third pasuk begins with Gada. So it's more than just an alphabetical acrostic, but it's borrowing the words from the from Megillat Eicha, from the second parak. Now look at the last line of each of these stanzas, and the last line is very important, not just because it's clever, but also because it's meaningful. What's the last line of the first stanza? V'nam im b'chukotai teilechu. Last line of the second stanza, v'natati ishmechem b'itam. Last line of the third stanza, v'sig lachem da'ish et patzir. Again, if you just dabble through it really quickly, you won't appreciate it. But these are the psukim taken from the beginning of Parashat B'chukotai. You got there the psukim in Vayikra Perek Kafav. So the bulk of Parashat B'chukotai is, of course, the Tochacha, the curses which were told to Am Yisrael. But they're preceded with the brachot. If you go walk in my statutes and you observe my commandments and you do them, then I will give you your rains in their right times. The threshing will catch up with the pressing, etc., etc. There'll be an abundance of things, and we've got all these promises which precede the Tochacha. This is a very important lesson for Tisha B'Av, because what we're saying on Tisha B'Av is think back to Parashat B'chukotai. We were promised 2 options. We were promised either an option of destruction, which is what happened, and certainly the Ramban in his commentary on Parashat B'chukotai says that the Tochacha in Parashat B'chukotai is a reference to the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. But before that, we've got the promise of blessings, the promise of all wonderful things. We could have had A, and we ended up with B. And that's what we're saying in this Kinnot. We're saying that all those things that were promised to us, we haven't got, and we wish that we had them. So that's an allusion that needs to be picked up on as well. Also, there's a very clever acrostic. We've got an alphabetic acrostic, Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Eicha, Bila, Gada, but you wouldn't necessarily notice at the first glance, there's a reverse acrostic as well. Look at the second word of each stanza, Tifarti, Shoftai, Rom. This is a reverse alphabetic acrostic. This is so complex. Can you imagine trying to write something like this, where you're trying to, sometimes at school, we tell the kids, write a poem, right? So at best, they can do some sort of acrostic, and they find the word, their name. Daniel, the first line will be with D, second line will begin with A, third line begin with N, and the whole thing will make no sense whatsoever because of the way they've been trying to construct it. So here we've got an acrostic which is making sense and making sure that the first word of every stanza is from the second perek of Eicha, and that the second word of each stanza is a letter, starts with a particular letter, and it all needs to make sense. And why is it forwards and backwards acrostics? So backwards acrostics are very often used. However, forwards and a backwards acrostic in the same piyut is less common. Maybe hafochba, vafochba, that turn it this way, turn it that way. We'll find allusions to everything. And then look at just, in this first stanza, So Echa tifarti meroshotai hishlichu. Okay, how is it that my glory has been cast down from my head? This isn't just a random phrase. Again, it's taken from that first pasuk in the second paragraph of Eicha. What's that first pasuk? Eicha ya'ef ba'po Adonai et Tzion, hishlich mishamayim eretz. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is cast down from the heavens to the ground. Tiferet Yisrael, the glory of the Jewish people. So Tifarti, my splendor, Meiroshotai Hishlichu, has been cast from my head. That's exactly a reference there to that pasuk. And then we've got Uchneged Kiser Kavod, Tselem Himlichu. They set up at Tselem an idol opposite the Kiser Kavod, opposite the throne of glory. Now that can just be an allegorical description of how we have betrayed HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that instead of presenting him with mitzvot, we presented him with avodah zarah. But in actual fact, we look at the Mishnah in Masechet Tanit. The Mishnah in Masechet Tanit tells us there were 5 tragedies which befell the Jewish people on Tisha B'Av and on Shiva Tammuz. Amongst the tragedies on Shiva Tammuz was the He'emid Tzelem B'Heichal, that an idol was set up in the Heichal, in the temple. So that's the reference there. Keneged Kiser Kavod, in front of the Aron in the temple. Tzelem Himlichu, they set up a tzelem. The Chalalei Tanai Asher Chozai Nimlachu, when they here it says profaned the conditions which the prophets Nimlachu had advised. Vanam, nam is Kinot, like making a statement. Im b'chukotai telechu. That's when the prophet said, Im b'chukotai telechu. If you go in my statutes, then you will get all these good things. And then we've got in the second stanza, Bila shoftai b'moatzot ivtam. That's he destroyed my judges. Bila shoftai, he wore them out. B'moatzot ivtam, because they had corrupted the counsel they were supposed to give. Ufanim histir mehem kashar avatatam, and he hid his face from them. That's kashar, when he saw avatatam, how crooked they were. What's this hiding his face? So the notion of hester panim is an important notion on Tisha B'Av. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has concealed himself from the Jewish people. That comes up in Parshat Ha'azinu. Vayomer astira panai mehem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that I will hide my face from them. And then the next line, v'yumar la'avak mitram lahavitam, and then instead of the blessing that he will, v'yumar la'avak mitram lahavitam, he scared them by changing the rain into dust. That's a pasuk from Eicha Perek Gimel. That's we've got Ra'ita Hashem Avatate, so that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has seen my crookedness, and we've got that Kashar Avatatam, and then the rain being turned into dust is again from the Tochacha in Sefer Devarim. Yitein Hashem et Matara Tzlacha Avat Va'afar. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will turn the rain from your land into Avat Va'afar, into dust and dirt. Instead of the blessing that I will give rain in their right times. And then we see that's in the third stanza as well. I've taken the various psukim from Tehillim and from Yechezkel and from Devarim, which each of those lines are reflecting. Gadar rom karnam ba'alumam hiktzir, hiktzarta yemei alumav, in Tehillim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's cut down the haughtiness, the might of the horn of Israel, and cut down, trimmed the young people. That's a pasuk in Tehillim. And again, the notion of being given over to the sword appears in Yechezkel. and Mazei Ra'av comes up in Devarim again. So all these reflections. And also we need to think about how the Kinot should be read. There's a question, how do you read the Kinot? How do you read Piyutim? How is it that we read, Yotzrot and Marafot? We mumble them off. Sometimes we mumble them off in a nice tune. But presumably they weren't composed with our tunes. It's a bit like, we read them, nicely in shul, a little bit of a chant. But can you imagine how Hamlet's soliloquy would sound? To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles. It loses it. That's not the way it's supposed to be. And so, we have traditional modes of chanting for the Kinot, but I don't think that's the way that they were supposed to be read. I'm not saying we shouldn't read them like that, but there's a meter to them which we also need to engage with. So that's what I wanted to share with you, that before I read this Kinah. And the notion that we should have really is that the theme going out through this Kinah is that we've exchanged the blessings that were promised to us in B'chukotai Telechu, if we walk in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ways, for the curses in B'chukotai Timasu, if we reject them. And this has to be one of the key themes also of Tisha B'Av. That's asking ourselves not just what has happened, but why it's happened. So we don't want to point fingers and say specifically, we can say this happened because Ploni Almoni did this, and that happened because this government made that decision, and this politician said that, and this rabbi did this, and this non-observant person did whatever, and that this observant person who should have known better did whatever else. But at least we should have a notion that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't punish us needlessly, but it's in B'chukotai Ta'asu. It's because as a people and individuals, we failed to engage properly with the mitzvot and the laws and the guidelines of the Torah. So Eichati farti me roshotai hishlichu, v'chegeged kisei kavod selem himlichu, v'chalalam tanai asher chozai nimlachu, v'nam im b'chukotai telechu. Bila shoftai b'moit soti v'tam, ufanim histir mehem kishar avatatam, vayumar la'avak mitram lahavitam, chelev v'natati gishmechem be'itam. Gadarun karnam va'unamam hiktir, uvivchat cherev sharehem hiktir, mezei ra'av as b'katzir, tumur v'hislachem dayish et batzir. Darach kashto v'chila b'cheretz, v'chabarzel ipel shmei eretz, p'ratzani shlosh esrei peretz, tachat v'natati shalom ba'aretz. Hayatzurchem u'ma'ozchem u'miskabchem, ha'pach la'achzar v'nilcham bachem, hanotzarchem richatchem, choshkechem tiavchem, v'ayehiv tachat, u'daftem et oivechem. V'yachamos pinat tzedek mleah, ki v'maskioteha matzah kol tumah, v'mechabdeha hiziluha, kedava metumata, v'shinui, v'radfu mikem chamisha mea. Tzanach elyon kiryat mo'adechem, v'hevil shareichel amitat raglechem, mi v'kesh zot, patz v'hoglechem, v'gamar omer, ufaniti alechem. Chashav Sano'om, Lukat Kashoshan, Umechelev Olaleha, Otan Dishan, Kitor Chupata, Hoalaka Kivshan, Vishalu Aye Dagan Tumur, Vachaltem Yashan Noshan. Tavu Nikasu Rovadei Duchanai, Begay Chamat Kanital Mechahanai, Hare Kamer Shanim Gila Yisod Mechonai, the Sami Tochi Omer, V'natati mishkani. Yeshru mevakim menaat meitechem. Ba'arba mitot hipil meitechem. Cherev v'arav v'chayav v'dever shichetechem. Kasar tsel, v'talachti b'tochachem. Kalu lashod kerega oholechem. Uvachem nishba'u moholelechem. Lechetchem nishba'u nafshot olalechem. B'moschem siach. Ani Adonai Elohechem. Limotam kilkul ana shiv'u. V'tzulam alachav sach menait she'u. Eretz HaKarmel haveitim v'shasha'u. V'sanu mochiach v'im lo tishma'u. Ma aidech yishishayich im guraich bosasu. Omrim al sus nanus al kena nasu. Nilaiti nasom avonotichem kahar masu. Vayasrechem kanamti im bechukotaitim asu. Neviayich ta'u tarmit shav chazot. Ve'edrosh lisloach vatzdi elazot. Petitim uchenegdi heishivu azot. Vanafti v'sachti afani esezot. Safku, charaku, sharku monai. Mibifnimim v'achutz lahatzmit emunai. Kivav zarim chelalut sufunai. L'ra'av v'lo l'tova nam v'natati panai. Patsu zaydim lifnei mitchaleh. Am keved avon pakad vayileh. Lo techaku od ot umofet v'afele. Anaf v'nasa v'nam v'imad eileh. Asa v'yarim kodkod b'nei sha'on. V'domi shikrani b'geith simaon. V'chol shana v'shana hosif yagon alon. Ma'ed ka'as v'nam v'shavarti et gaon. Sa'ak hoi hoi v'ashpato heirik. Mipo hevi alai ma'arik. V'v'lagei ma'og shinei tsar hecherik. V'chila kochi bin v'tam larik. Kumi, dofki, shavi, al domi. Utnicha of me'eretz kolech v'adomi. Me rosh ishkani v'hidmi. V'chashach hinuchi bin v'im teilechu imi. Ra'ei goral ivita. Husam la'iyat. V'likat midbar hayiti dumuyat. Gola kunuyat v'sura gunuyat. V'shomi v'ishlachti v'achem et chayat. Shachvu be'iluf ketom ichmar v'ein doleh. Hamleim ga'ar v'ein marpeh oleh. Harei kamesh anim hamamani lihitkaleh. Anushim b'vikuach v'im ba'eleh. Tikra eid olal ta'al admoni. V'sachafo l'shasafo shivatayim ka'oni. Tahom tarai b'tzeit kol me'armoni. Kinehemamti b'riv v'halachti af'ani. Afani lukad biyokesh shikaron. Arva simcha v'hispit charon. La'aretz eishei v'hege b'garon. Eicha yashava chavatzeret hasharon. We're going to continue in a moment with one of the narrative Kinot. And that's the Kinot Zechor Asher Asa Tzar Bifnim, which will be on page 111 in the Rosenfeld, page 226 in the Art Scroll, and then on page 361 in the Koren. And this is a Kinot which describes events at the time of the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, when the Roman Emperor Titus came in and defiled the Beit HaMikdash, consorted with a harlot in the Kodesh HaKodashim, pierced the parochet in front of the Kodesh HaKodashim, and it dripped with blood as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu had been killed. If there are people who want to go, and to finish off with Tzion now, Ashrei, Tzion, Kaddish, then please feel free to do so outside now. If not, go as you wish, or we'll finish off at the end of the morning. What I want to do is look at one of the rabbinic texts today that describe the events of the Churban HaBayit. The Churban HaBayit is very interesting. The destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash is what actually happened is barely mentioned. You look in Sefer Melachim, the end of Sefer Melachim, that it says that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. Nothing more than that. There's prophecies about the run-up to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, description of the destruction of the walls of Yerushalayim and the siege of Yerushalayim, both in Sefer Malachim and also in Sefer Yirmiyah. But Sefer Yirmiyah just says, "V'chasher Hogla Yehuda," that Yehuda was exiled, and that was it. No description of what actually happened. But the rabbinic literature pads it out and suggests what happened. There are Gemaras primarily in Masechet Gittin, in other places as well as lots of Midrash. The Gemara in Masechet Tanit, in the last parak on Daf Kaf Tet, describes how the Kohanim came. The Beit HaMikdash was in fire. The Kohanim came. They had the keys of the Beit HaMikdash, and they said, "We haven't been good custodians of the Beit HaMikdash," and they threw them up heavenwards. And Kamein Pisat Yad, a sort of divine hand, came out of heaven and took the keys. And that's what I want to look at today, but a wider description, broader description from the Pesikta Rabbati. So the Pesikta Rabbati is a Midrashic text. It's a late Midrashic text. So it was written in the 9th century, at almost at the time of the Gaonim, but it's drawing on earlier texts as well, and combining ideas that appear in other Midrashim and padding it out somewhat. So we're on page 11 in the handout, and we're going to be 6 lines down from the top. And this describes what happened at the time of the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. The Kinnot that we're going to read will describe what happened at the time of the second Beit HaMikdash. This is the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. Kevan sheyatza Yirmiyahu miYerushalayim. So when Yirmiyahu left Yerushalayim, Yarad hamalach min hashamayim. An angel came down from Shamayim. V'natan raglav al chomot Yerushalayim upartsan, and placed its legs on the walls of Yerushalayim and caused them to break. So it's conjuring up an image of an angel coming down and standing on the walls of Yerushalayim and toppling them. Karav Amar, and the angel called out, Yavo hasonim yikansu lebayit she'adono eino b'tocho v'yavzu oto v'yecheravu. So the angel called out and said, the enemy should come in, hasonim, those who hate the Jewish people, yikansu lebayit, and they should go into the building, that its master isn't there any longer, and they can despoil it and destroy it. So I think this is very important. It's very important because the Midrash is telling us that it might seem from the Pesukim like it was the Kasdim who destroyed the walls of Yerushalayim, but in actual fact it wasn't. It was an angel that came down and destroyed them. That's the first thing that I think it's telling us. Of course, it was in a physical sense, it was the Kasdim, but we shouldn't think that the Kasdim had any real zechut that they could overpower the walls. The walls of Yerushalayim were so precious and so strong that what did it take to destroy them? It was an angel from Hashem. That's number one. Number two, we should be aware that when the enemy went into Yerushalayim and went into the Beit HaMikdash, they were going into empty shell already. They weren't doing anything special. And this is important, I think. The message that the Midrash wants to give us is an important message. It's that don't think that Nebuchadnezzar was so wonderful. Don't think that, transferring it to the times of the second Beit HaMikdash, that Titus was so powerful. It's very easy to knock over a house made of straw. If it's made of bricks, it's much harder. But the Beit HaMikdash, yes, it was made of bricks, but really it was made of straw. What kept the Beit HaMikdash standing was absent. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was there no longer. They can go in, it's a kerem, describing Beit HaMikdash as a vineyard. They can chop down the vines because the owners left there. Don't you think that you destroyed it? It was HaKadosh Baruch Hu destroyed it because of the sins of Am Yisrael. Kiria kavusha kavashtem. You've conquered a conquered city. Am harug haragtem. You've killed a dead people. So the enemy came in and they set up a platform on Har HaBayit. Halchu va'alu lahem b'vima emtza'it makom va'alu lahem b'vima emtza'it makom she'amelech Shlomo yoshev notel eitza min hazikenim. So what did they do? They set up a platform in the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash, exactly where Shlomo HaMelech had set up a platform in his time, and where he would consult with the elders. Misham shenishtachlel Beit HaMikdash, sham yashu hasonim v'natlu eitza he'ach lisros Beit HaMikdash. So in the same place where Shlomo HaMelech had consulted with how to build the Beit HaMikdash, they came and consulted how to destroy the Beit HaMikdash. So this is obviously a literary allusion as to the insult. It wasn't just the Beit HaMikdash was being destroyed, but the same way that it was built, it was an irony being built into the story here. Where Shlomo HaMelech had decided to build, they would decide to destroy. Whilst they were discussing it, they looked up. ובידם 4 לפיתים של אש, ונתנו ב4 זוויות של היכל, ושרפו אותו. So what happened here? 4 angels came down from heaven, each one of them carrying flaming torches, put them in the 4 corners of the heichal and burned it. So I think we've got 2 things going on here. Number one, again, it's re-emphasizing the notion it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu built the Beit HaMikdash. It wasn't the Babylonians. The Babylonians, yes, of course they built the Beit HaMikdash. Essentially, it was coming from Hashem. There's also a very clever allusion, I think, here. Anybody able to pick up on what Mishnah this is reminding us of? Oh, very good. Simchat Beit HaShoeva, Mishnah in Masechet Sukkah. The Mishnah in Masechet Sukkah tells us that there were Arba Pirchei Kahuna, there were 4 menorot arranged round the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash, and there were Arba Pirchei Kahuna who ascended these lampposts with kadin jugs of oil, and they lit the lamps. So what was this is exactly mirroring this and paralleling it. What was once upon a time the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, that was how the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash was celebrated. Here is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They danced in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shavtem Mayim Sason Mimayinei HaYeshua. Now we've got the opposite. 4 angels coming with torches and destroying the Beit HaMikdash. Kisher Ra'a Kohen Gadol Shenisraf Beit HaMikdash. When the Kohen Gadol saw that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. So this is interesting because in the Bavli it says it wasn't the Kohen Gadol, it was the Pirchei Kahuna. Presumably it's very similar. Natalet HaMaftechot Zrakan Hashamayim. He took the keys of the Beit HaMikdash and threw them up to heaven. Patach Piv Va'amar. He opened his mouth and he said, Hare Maftechot Shel Beitecha. Here are your keys back. Apitrophus Shel Sheker Hayiti B'tocho. I was a false guardian. I didn't look after false custodian. So the Kohen Gadol started leaving the Beit HaMikdash. Tafsu oto sonim shachatu oto eitel hamizbeach. The sonim took him and shechted him by the mizbeach. Makom shaya makrivet hatamid. The exact place where he'd offered up the korban tamid. Tamid was shechted near the mizbeach. That's where the Kohen Gadol was shechted. His daughter came out and saw what had happened, crying, and she cried out, "Woe to my father, the desirable focus of my eyes." Tafsu ota. the enemy came and grabbed hold of her, shachatu ota, and shechted her, ve'irvu dama b'dama viha. What Mishnah does that remind you of? In Masechet, sorry? Yom Kippur. Masechet Yoma describes how the Kohen Gadol took the Dam HaPar and the Dam HaSa'ir and mixed them together. Here we've got the mixing of the blood of the Kohen Gadol and his daughter. Very powerful images of what we used to do at the Mizbeach is now happening to us. And perhaps there's a notion that this is a korban. We obviously don't believe in human sacrifice at all, but at least the notion that when we are sacrificed by others, that it should come the chaper in the way that sacrifices that we brought came the chaper. When the Kohanim and the Levim saw that the Beit HaMikdash had been destroyed, they took their musical instruments and they jumped into the fire and allowed themselves to be burnt. And when the virgins, who were the ones who wove the parochet, saw that the Beit HaMikdash had been destroyed, also naflu ba'esh v'nisrafu, they jumped into the fire and were burned. Shelo ya'anu atan hasadim, so that the enemy shouldn't defile them. And that's again a notion that comes up in the Kinot that we're going to read, at the time of the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, that when the 600 young people were taken abroad and to the Romans, and the plan was that the Romans were going to defile them, but they committed suicide. So we've obviously got to, that's Gemara in Gittin, we've obviously got texts drawing off each other. So King Tzidkiah tried to escape through an underground tunnel that led out to Yericho. So he ran through this, and let his sons run through first. So they were sent, they captured them themselves, sent to Nebuchadnezzar. And okay, fine, we won't continue through the rest of this passage. But I think the image of casting the keys heavenwards is a very important image. And I've taken on the next page, passage from this I found in the Chorev journal. It's Yeshiva University, where Yeshiva Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan produced a journal in the 1930s called Chorev. And there's an article on this about the Agadot of the Churban. He makes the observation about what was so special about the keys. What was so special about the keys of the Beit HaMikdash? We talk about the Kalim of the Beit HaMikdash. One of the Kinot talks about the 93 Kalim, Klei Sharet of the Beit HaMikdash. The keys weren't amongst those Klei Sharet. They weren't the vessels that were used in the Beit HaMikdash. So it seems strange that, the Kinot talk about the capture of the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash, but why have we got anything special about the keys? Why was it the keys that were thrown up heavenwards? If you look in the fourth line, he asks that question. That's Mishum Mazachu HaMaftechot, Shagadat Chonein Otam Bahadar Kisma. That's what was so special about the keys that the Agadah discusses them. It's not just that we want to have something sort of that sounds interesting or dramatic or something. There's a key message to the keys. It's like closing up the Beit HaMikdash. These keys were the ones that would lock up the Beit HaMikdash. This is symbolic of the Kohanim giving up the Beit HaMikdash to Shammai, saying we're no longer able to be custodians of it. We can no longer look after it. They, in Israel, they used to tell a joke about the time of the 6-Day War. During the 6-Day War, lots of people were fleeing the country, and people were sending children to relatives abroad, and there was questions whether it was a good idea to do so or not to do so. They were told there was going to be maybe a mass exodus from Israel. The joke was going around, will the last one out turn off the lights at Ben Gurion? That's what they were saying. That's, they didn't leave, and Baruch Hashem, they didn't leave, and we were victorious. That's what's exactly going on in this Agadah. That it's this sense of we tried to look after the place, we weren't able to. We're giving back the keys. You think of when you're you're renting a property and the rental comes to an end, and you give back the keys to the landlord. This is no longer belonging to you. And this is the powerful imagery of this Agadah. Somewhere, I couldn't find it, but I seem to think in one of Elie Wiesel's books, where he describes the Shoah, he has this image of the Kohanim throwing the keys back to heaven and the Pisat Yad coming out to take them. So in any event, we're going to continue now with Zachor Et Asher Asah Bifnim, page 111 in the Rosenfeld, 226 in the Art Scroll, 361 in the Kotel.
Naming the Lafi, Steffi Top Midom, Yotsonin Hava is the Havai Malayot, Al Hagai Havai Stobar, and Otso Alei Yot, Loylis Kabar, it's trying to follow in Asher Bonko Bar, Vani beside Ibuya, or Roots Aid of the Sava or Havai Satan's or Rocky, Zubakarova, Law Age. Zet zou al zijn eigen is gelijk niet geboren is. Aber den niet te doen zu kein labas is. Waarom hebben wij ze is? Wie maar een schalach is. De nachten zal nu krijgt ziekelijke reis. Someone born isha ik born isha is. I reign no maak kies kimisha reis. Lai mat artish nu schalach schalach is. Noshim kasher uki wa aris. The Karka is no love heritage. So new pots the boy porridge. The base credit shakadosh in Sakama Soyesher is. Bapurin me bapus todum fuzakin. The sorrow kiyusak shishin revive mazekin. Zekin in also here to Gumish Kakin. Asses Ritzono, who also bazekin. Shavas Satan by a voyage mine. By Sabe Khima by a face Homa, not law ever off, Amni Pizza Lapus were Amlin, Al Kinuta, Ashmi like Armahin, Al Pesakahaba is Hey Boy, the Yadarba Roshate After of the Hakariva, Absadma Robbie the Secher is weird boy, the Tog Akarkos Lake move like robbery boy. Atokot Sato fish race all the fanois. You lot in a sharing bohem come and we shall lay on a place. Lomorok sugar in Buloy Shata and Hammond Hopper noise. The Shilukum lair at school, so the Shaloish Safino is. Hashive nu shivu, Kuvo beneath Vayon. The Shitafu Asmonia, Adlin point by your own. Shirvasush Sharu Alyon. Yalaka Hirat, new beautiful your keeps the high my spot will add enough shown. Cause for us, new Veloshika, and new Kokilu shown. It was some nostril when they shaped me for shown. Vasco Nishma
Ura Lama Sishan. Going to continue with the Kinavim of Tochalna on page 120 in the Rosenfeld. Page 232 in the Art Scroll and page 375 in the Koran. This is a Kinot ostensibly about the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, though in actual fact, it doesn't actually mention the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. The Kinah that we just read was about the Churban HaBayit, but this is a Kinah about the human tragedy that accompanies the Churban HaBayit. And I think these are really three themes that have to be considered throughout the Kinot, and three themes of Tisha B'Av. Maybe there are even more. One is the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the if you like, the spiritual destruction of Am Yisrael. The other is the Galut from Eretz Yisrael, if you like, the national destruction. And there's also the personal suffering, the personal destruction, and everything to do with the Churban HaBayit, and possibly everything to do with every Jewish tragedy that has taken place over the course of history is composed of those three strands: the spiritual, the national, and the personal. Looking at this Kinah, though, every year when I read it, I have a sense that this isn't just a Kinah about Churban HaBayit. This is a Kinah at least equally about the Shoah, and maybe about other tragedies in the course of Jewish history. Just look at the English, and anybody who's, all of us, we've all read accounts of the horrible, terrible things that were done in the Shoah, and these are described exactly in this Kinah. This is a tragically prophetic Kinah. Just looking through the English, when I think of how the flesh of fathers were prepared as food for their children in caves and ditches, when I think how the daughters were clasped, swollen from starvation, in their mother's lap, when I think how the spirits of dead infants hover over their swollen corpses that lie about the streets of the city. We've all seen those pictures. We've seen those photographs from the Shoah, photographs from the camps, photographs from the ghettos of Jewish bodies lying there half naked, swollen, emaciated. This is a description of something that happened 2,500 years ago, and a description of something that happened 75 years ago. When I think how the women were burdened with miscarrying wounds and dried up breasts, and each mother weeps over her children that are sinking to death. And these are Kinot about the timelessness of Jewish suffering. When I think how in exhaustion 1,000 would diminish to 100, 100 to 10, and 10 to 1. Think about the communities of the Kinnot HaKodesh through Europe, which once upon a time were thriving centers, and now there's maybe some of them 1 Jew left, 2 Jews left, something like that. Places where there were hundreds or thousands of Jews pre-war. When I think how all those souls were burnt like the loppings of thorn bushes, that's a description of the crematoria. When I think how 9 calves of children's brains were piled up on one stone, when I think of how 300 sucklings were impaled, stretched out on a single branch, when I think of how tender and delicate women were seen walking in fetters at the hand of the chief executioner. Let's think about Mengele selection lines and all those images that we're all too familiar with. The other thing that I think comes up very much from this Kinah is it's not just about human suffering, it's about the suffering, of course, of Jewish children. One of the most powerful aspects of Yad Vashem is I think it's called the Hall of the Children. What's it called? I don't recall what it is, but you walk through and it's just names after names of the children being called out and names being projected, etc. That's how many children perished in the Shoah. And we see in this Kinah as well how many children perished at the time of the Churban HaBayit. Again, this is one of Kale's compositions, and I think it sheds light on the question that we might have about the Kinot in general, in terms of how much of them are accounts of what really happened, and how much of them are poetry about what might have happened or what we imagined happened. And I think, 100 years ago, we might have read this Kinot, we might have wondered, is this taking poetic license? We've got some details in Chazal and some details in Mikra of what happened, and it's being expounded on to make us feel the pain. Or is this a real description of what happened? And history has shown that this is actually a real description of what happened. So much of this happened in Europe 80 years ago. So therefore, what's to say that it didn't, if we've been told this was written about Europe, well, of course it's true, because we know it's true. So presumably it's true also about the Churban HaBayit. Just following through as Avi read this, we had to write at the beginning, the third line, and I think how the tresses of their head could be cut off and tied as adornment upon the enemy's fleet horses. So Rav Soloveitchik, in his shiurim on the Kinot, he described how one of his cousins was taken by the Nazis and tied to the back of a car and dragged through the streets of, I think it was Vilna or wherever it was, but in exactly that way, history repeating itself in that way. We're going to move on to the Kinot of Lecha Hashem Hatzdaka on page 123 in the Rosenfeld, 240 in the Art Scroll, and 393 in the Koren. And this is one of the compare and contrast Kinot, where we're going to compare the kindness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu throughout Jewish history with Am Yisrael on the one hand, with the shame and embarrassment that we should feel on the other hand about what we've done and we haven't followed in his statutes. And a key theme of this Kinot is a key theme of teshuvah, that we should be repenting towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, coming closer to him. So again, we're seeing this theme of learning to take responsibility for what is happening to Am Yisrael.
Lechad Me'atz B'Chol Elohim Niftus L'Olam Yom Goshes HaPonim B'V'Yam V'Yam Sof Doi Beit Yehosh Lechad Me'atz B'Chol B'Zicher Batem Meidai V'Ani Elohim Yom Goshes HaPonim B'Charfinu B'Sin Asi Yom Elohim Lechad Me'atz B'Chol Tam She'Tam Tonu Tzapich B'Dvosh Yom Goshes HaPonim Yom Kekavnu L'Fanov Suras Hashem L'Uvosh Lechad Me'atz B'Chol B'Chil Kol Ma'onu V'Erban Mut Onon Yom Goshes HaPonim B'Lechem HaKrokel Sinu B'Chol Leichem Lechad Me'atz B'Chol B'Amid Baruch Osarnu B'Chol Yom Goshes HaPonim B'Niatzos Lo'or M'Chatzirus V'Dizahov K'Mekivor Lechad Me'atz B'Chol B'Sichon B'Og B'Chol Ma'nachos Kinot Yom Goshes HaPonim B'Chol Asher Mal B'Achirem B'Dim B'Tzon Lechad Me'atz B'Chol B'Fal Asher Pa'alcha V'Arba Asar Loshim Yom Goshes HaPonim B'Tzeh Michal B'Chol Anach Loshim Lechad Me'atz B'Chol B'Kimas Shilo V'Nov V'Givon V'Feis V'Lomim Yom Goshes HaPonim B'Vesha Shenim Tzom Sh'Charu V'Om Onim V'Lomim Lechad Me'atz B'Chol B'Shnei Korbanos Sh'Charu V'Seinu V'Onu Kayonim Yom Goshes HaPonim B'Shovenu Yinecha B'Chol Dei Sh'Choshuv V'Yinu V'Chalim Lechad Me'atz B'Chol B'Shama Elos Chomosh Ha'isol Sinor Kilushom V'Hishoma Yom Goshes HaPonim So Va'ish Kamidos V'Shiva
Hatel Ohayos Necha Ushama. We're now going to move on to the Kinot Halakhot on page 125 in the Rosenfeld, 248 in the Art Scroll, 415 in the Koren, and this is the first of a number of historical Kinot which don't really deal at all with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and deal with other events in the course of Jewish history. This one actually is somewhat linked to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash because it's describing events that took place not so long after the Churban HaBayit, and perhaps as a direct result of the Churban HaBayit. Nevertheless, this is the account of the 10 martyrs, the 10 rabbis, custodians of the Torah, who were put to death by the Romans for teaching Torah. We've discussed some of these Tanaim in detail in previous years, so actually we're not going to look at it in detail again this year, but we've seen other Midrashim. We've compared it in the past with Alei Ezkara, which is a which is a Slicha on Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur we say a Slicha about this, and on Tisha B'Av we say a Kinot about this theme. We pointed out that now, in fact, looking at different texts, there's Midrash Alei Ezkara. So there's a collection of Midrashim which is about the death of the martyrs. If we put together all the texts, we find that in actual fact there were more than 10 of them. But each of the texts chooses 10 who were put to death, and they didn't all live contemporaneously at the same time, but they were slightly different generations. But this was a project, unfortunately, that went on over the course of time. Rav Soloveitchik, in his comments to the Kinot, makes the observation that why did this happen? It makes the observation that at the time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, Jews were allowed to carry on learning Torah. That was the deal that was negotiated by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai when he was carried out of Yerushalayim. Teini Yavne v'chachameha. Okay, you're going to destroy Yerushalayim. We can live with that, but let us at least have an academy in Yavne. And why was it that the Romans agreed to that? How could they agree to such a thing? Let Torah flourish in Yavne. The answer is because it was inconceivable to them that was what would happen. They thought that without a Beit HaMikdash, Am Yisrael would fall apart. That the Jewish people couldn't continue to exist without a Beit HaMikdash. What Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his contemporaries were aware of was, in actual fact, we can continue to exist without a Beit HaMikdash. We can't continue to exist without Torah. And therefore, that's he asked for taking Yavne Mechaneh. He wanted to be able to establish an academy of Torah. The Romans thought that would be meaningless. Yeah, fine, they'll have a library and they'll have a few shiurim, and that'll be it. And within a generation, they'll all be gone. They underestimated the power of Torah, and when they saw the power of Torah, that's why they realized that destroying the Beit HaMikdash by itself wasn't enough. They had to try and destroy Torah. And the way you destroy Torah is by destroying its chachamim. Of course, what Jewish history has shown is that Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai was clearly right. For 2,000 years almost, we haven't had the Beit HaMikdash. But has Am Yisrael survived, and has Am Yisrael flourished, and has Am Yisrael had golden eras? The answer is yes. Why has it had its golden eras? It's had its golden eras because of Torah. And in actual fact, we've seen that any place where Torah is lacking, then within a couple of generations, Am Yisrael disappears as well. Look in the course of history, any movement within Judaism which has abandoned Torah, study of Torah and observance of Torah, then disappears pretty quickly afterwards. The only part of Judaism which survives throughout the generations and flourishes continuously is the Torah community. And Torah is something which has to be shared by all of Am Yisrael, and we should learn from the course of history that without Torah, there can't be Am Yisrael. So we continue with the Kinot of Alei HaLevanon.
Alei HaLevanon Adirei HaTorah, Alei Sreitzin, the Mishnah of Gemara, Barecha, Amaleha, Tzahara, Tamam Nishbach, V'Nashtal Korah. Kinot B'Doshay Harulema Tzahara, Alei Ani B'Chia, Ve'ini Nibra. Zos V'Zachri Ezach Gemara, Hamdas Yisrael Pei HaKadesh Nezebat Torah. Tarei Kedoshim Mesu Kamisa Hamura. Radu Doral Mi Rishon Lachar Burra. Infol Doral Al Rabban Shimon Hashat Sabaro. Vacha Nixura Sera. Rabban Shimon Chazar Haigmon Al Gabanet Shusura. Zera Aaron Shal Babaksha. The curse Al Ben Halbira. Natsal Nasana Al Alkvosov Munara. Some Einav Alinav Ofiv Ofiv Bahbakura. Anav Amar Peh Hamiskababa Torah. Nisam Nikmasa Alav Nisam Shunav Hamura. Sabah Nahashit Esrashav Sa'ah Haskira. Yam Ba'aro Amrul Nasheth Shchi Nabara. Rasha Pashet Al Rasha Pashet Es Hikiana Makam Filin Nisvasvara. Sa'ata Nizdaza Alam Be'eretz Para. Ma'farab Heviu Es Rabbi Akiva. O Ker Harim B'Tachanan Zu Isvara. B'Sarku Es B'Sar B'Masreit Shel Barzel Lehishtabra. Yatzan Ishmasa Be'achad B'Vaskal Amra. Ashrecha Rabbi Akiva. B'Fach Tahar B'Chol Minei Tahara. Ben Baba Rabbi Yehuda Acharav. Heviu B'Shivra Lev Ashara. Neherav Ben Shivim Shana B'Tei Arora. Yoshev B'Sanis Hayan Akiva Chassid. B'Mar B'Mlachto L'Mahara. Rabbi Khalil Ben Tarajan Acharav Makil Gilas B'Sion Sha'ara. Yoshev B'Daresh B'Sefer Imo. B'Kifuhu B'Chablei Zmara. And Sa'ur Sisu B'Hem B'Prafuhu B'Sefer Torah. Slugim Shel Tzemeh Hanichu Al Libo Shelo Yomos Mahera. Chassid Rabbi Yeshvav Sofer Harguhu Im Amara. Amara. Zrakuhu Vishtichuhu Laklavim V'lo Ukbar Ikvara. Tilsavas Kadalav Shelo Hinyak Klo Mitaras Moshe L'Shomra V'Achrav Halifutzbis Yom Hebra. Of Kaparach Nisraf B'Havel Tiv V'Amdura. Tzadik Rabbi Lezer Ben Shemua B'Acharna Neherag Madkira. Yom Erev Shabbat Haya Zman Kiddush V'Yakadesh V'Yikra. חרב שלחו עליו, ולא הניחוהו בחיים לגמרי, יצא נשמתו, וברא אלוהים באשר וצר וצרה. כהנה וכהנה הוסיפו בני עוולה לאנוס בגערה, סקילה, שריפה, הרג וחנק, מיוחד לשערה, וסרס ממנה יכלו אריה זה וזרה. חזה נפרשת התרומה, טרפו אריה והכפירה. ייטיב אדוני ולא יוסיף עוד ביעשרה. אמץ ברכיים, כשלוש חלק יעשרה ומשיח בצרה. בצדק ימלוך מלך יאמר
And we're now going to turn to H2 Kabbalah B, page 144 in the Rosenfeld, page 304 in the Art Scroll, page 515 in the Koren. And what this Kinot does is it really heightens the sense of destruction when we talk not only about the destruction, but we compare and contrast with the glory and how wonderful it was when the Jewish people left Mitzrayim. The pasuk says that V'nei Yisrael yatsu biyad ramah. They went out with, really proud of themselves. That's how we left Mitzrayim. But we left Yerushalayim with a sense of shame. Ishtukat bekirbi marotei alibi betzeiti mimitzrayim inimi ayira lamanaskira betzeiti mirushalayim as yashem Moshe shelo yinashe betzeiti mimitzrayim Vayikronei Yirmiyah, V'nahi V'hiniyah, V'zeiti Mirushalayim, Beiti Tkonan, V'shachar He'anan, V'zeiti Mimitzrayim, V'chamaz El Shachna, Alei Ka'anana, V'zeiti Mirushalayim, Gare Yabhamu, V'chachoma Kamu, V'zeiti mimitzrayim, Zedolim shatavu, V'yarosh yitzavu, V'zeiti mirushalayim, Dergan shamayim, V'tzor yatzumayim, V'zeiti mimitzrayim, La'avet hamrurim, U'mayim hamarim, V'zeiti mirushalayim, Hashkei b'harei, Sovimot harchorei, V'zeiti mimitzrayim, Korei le'evel, Amar of Bavel, V'zeiti Yerushalayim, U'marei kavod Adonai, Keishon chelen lefanai, V'zeiti mimitzrayim, V'cherem v'tusha, V'tevach v'tusha, V'zeiti Yerushalayim, Zevach mincha, v'shemen hamishcha, v'zeiti mimitzrayim, Zkudat elekucha, katzon latecha, v'zeiti mirushalayim, Chagim v'shabbatot, v'motim v'rotot, v'zeiti mimitzrayim, Tanit v'hevel, v'dov ha'hevel, v'zeiti mirushalayim, Tov v'ohalim, ya'at galim, v'zeiti mimitzrayim, Ohalei Yishmaelim, Machanot Areilim, V'zeiti Yerushalayim, Yovel Shmita, Ve'emet Shoketa, V'zeiti mimitzrayim, V'chumit V'itut, V'charut V'kritud, V'zeiti Yerushalayim, Kaporet V'aron, Me'avli Zikaron, V'zeiti mimitzrayim, V'avli Hakana, V'ha'bahana, V'zeiti Yerushalayim, Levim V'aharonim, V'shivim Zekenim, V'zeiti mimitzrayim, Noksivu Morim, V'mokrim V'korim, V'zeiti Yerushalayim, Moshe Yereinu, V'aron Yateinu, V'zeiti mimitzrayim, L'Bchat Netzatitsa, Vadriamus Keitza, L'Tzeiti Yerushalayim, La'arov Milchama, Vadonai Shama, L'Tzeiti Mimitzrayim, Rachak B'menu, B'neinenu, L'Tzeiti Yerushalayim, Sitrei Marochet, Sitrei Marochet, L'Tzeiti Mimitzrayim, Chema Mitachet, Vadai Sochalachet, L'Tzeiti Yerushalayim, Olot Zabachim, Rishei Nichochim, L'Tzeiti Mimitzrayim, L'Chutzot V'Dukarim, L'Tzion HaYikarim, Parei Mikbaot, Lachavot Mikbaot, L'Tzeiti Mimitzrayim, Shukot Truot, V'Kolot Zlavot, L'Tzeiti Yerushalayim, Sitz HaZahav, V'Ham Shel Barahav, L'Tzeiti Mimitzrayim, Yerushalayim Etzem, Yafas HaEtzem, L'Tzeiti Yerushalayim, Kedusha L'Vuach, V'Odad HaYera, L'Tzeiti Mimitzrayim, Nigala L'Orah, V'Ruach HaTorah, L'Tzeiti Yerushalayim, Rina Yeshua, Chatzot HaTorah, L'Tzeiti Mimitzrayim, Zakat Olam, Zakat Chama, L'Tzeiti Yerushalayim, Shulchan Menorah, V'Chalel Torah, L'Tzeiti Mimitzrayim, Elul V'Torah, Chesed V'Tzedakah, L'Tzeiti Yerushalayim, Torah U'Todah, L'Seder Avodah, L'Tzeiti Mimitzrayim, Sason L'Simcha, L'Nas Yaakov Ha'Nacha, L'Tzeiti Yerushalayim. We're going to move on now to page 155 in the Rosenfeld, page 338 in the Art Scroll, page 577 in the Koren, and we're going to read one of the what's known as the Tzionim, the Kinot, which deal with Tzion, known as the Zionides. The first and perhaps most famous of those Kinot is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's Tzion Halot Yishalim Yishlam Asirayich, which is on page 152, a couple of Kinot previously. We read that and spoke about it and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi a couple of years back. So today I want us to read a Kinah by Rabbi Eliezer Hadarshan, again at a similar time as Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, again describing the beauty of Tzion. And this marks a dramatic shift in the order of the Kinot. Till now, all the Kinot have been Kinot of mourning, and now we're moving over to Kinot of yearning, or Kinot of longing, a longing for a restoration of the beauty of Yerushalayim. And this is really reflects, I think, what happens, a transition that we experience even with Avelut Chadasha. Many people here are blessed not to have had to sit Shiva, but some of us have sat Shiva for relatives. And I think very often what happens when you're sitting Shiva is during the week of Shiva, you go through a transition process. You start off, the Gemara says that Shlosha Yamim Lebechi, the first 3 days of Avelut are for crying. You're distraught at what's happened. Very often you're shocked and traumatized by the loss of the relative. And then we say the rest of the Shiva is Lahesped, is for remembering and eulogizing the person who's passed away. And you go through this transition of, first it's, whoa, this terrible tragedy has happened, but then you're able to remember not just the last hours and the last days and the last weeks of the person who passed away, but you're able to think more clearly about better times in the past. And you're able to actually think about the good times. Very often when a person's died, particularly if they've been ill for a period of time, your immediate thoughts are about, just this person lying in a hospital bed being ill and this person wasting away. But human beings, there's much more to them to that. And there's many, many years of productive and meaningful life. And as the Shiva progresses, you're able to remember that. And this is what we're doing during the Kinot as well. We spent the first 2/3 of the Kinot talking about the destruction of Yerushalayim. Eicha. How has this happened? All these terrible things. But now we're able to remember, in actual fact, not just the destruction, but we're able to mourn through remembering the beauty of Yerushalayim. Rav Soloveitchik says that there are two concepts when we talk about Zeicher L'Churban. There's two different things that we do to remind us of Yerushalayim. One is a din like M'shayer Amal Amal. We spoke about this in the Shir on Tuesday night. That when you build a home, you decorate it, you leave an Amah by an Amah undecorated. To remind you, Zeicher L'Churban, to remind you of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. When we're at a chuppah, we break a glass, Zeicher L'Churban, to remind us of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. But there are other things which are not Zeicher L'Churban, but which are Zeicher L'Mikdash. The way we mourn or remember the Beit HaMikdash is Zeicher L'Mikdash, remembering and thinking about the beauty of the Beit HaMikdash, how wonderful it was. It says, what's the best example of that? The best example of that is Netilat Lulav. According to the Torah, you only bench Lulav all 7 days in the Beit HaMikdash. I forget Rambam and the other Mefarshim whether that means Yerushalayim as a whole or just the Beit HaMikdash. Certainly outside of Yerushalayim, you only bench Lulav 1 day. But after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, in Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, there would be Netilat Lulav all 7 days, not Zeicher L'Churban, but Zeicher L'Mikdash. So we should remember how wonderful, how beautiful Yerushalayim was once upon a time. Also, Sfirat HaOmer is Zeicher L'Mikdash. Nowadays, according to many Rishonim, there's no mitzvah Sfirat HaOmer without the Korban HaOmer. It's Machloket Rishonim. Sefer Chinuch and others say that there is, but the Maisa we tend to paskin that it's Midrabanan because there's no Korban HaOmer. But why is it? It's Zeicher L'Mikdash. It's not Zeicher L'Churban. To remember Yerushalayim b'Vinyana, Yerushalayim when it was built up. And these Kinot describe not Yerushalayim lying in ruins, but they describe Yerushalayim looking beautiful. And not only a physical beauty, but also a supernatural beauty. They describe how just the air of Eretz Israel and the air of Yerushalayim is something special. Chachamim say that the air of Eretz Israel is machkin. It makes us wise. Rabbi Yehuda Alei, he describes how just the air of Eretz Israel is more beautiful, is purer than the air anywhere else. And I don't know if you were to do a scientific test on the air of Eretz Israel, you would find that it's necessarily true. Certainly when you're driving from Yerushalayim towards the airport, Tel Aviv, you see a smog over Tel Aviv. I don't know if it's purer air, but it's a psychological notion. My late mother, Alei Shalom, always used to believe that Jaffa oranges tasted better than any other oranges. Now, personally, I like Spanish oranges. I think they taste the best. But there's something amazing about being able to convince yourself that Israeli oranges just taste so much better than any other oranges. And that is the beauty of Eretz Israel. That is what these Kinot are describing. So it's not just the Paitanim of the Kinot that describe the beauty of Yerushalayim in this way. And I put in the pack, we won't go through all of it at all, I put in the pack some passages from Shai Agnon. Shai Agnon was the poet laureate, the national poet of Israel, a Nobel Peace winner, and he describes the beauty of Eretz Israel. I want to look particularly at page 19. Look at page 19. We have the beauty of Eretz Israel described here. And this is his acceptance speech in 1966 in Stockholm, where he says, it said in the Talmud, in Jerusalem, men of discrimination did not sit down to dine in company until they knew who their companions were to be. So I will now tell you who am I, whom you've agreed to have at your table. And he started off by saying, as a result of the historic catastrophe in which Titus of Rome destroyed Jerusalem and Israel was exiled from its land, I was born in one of the cities of the exile, but I always regarded myself as one who was born in Jerusalem. In a dream and a vision of the night, I saw myself standing with my brother Levites in the holy temple, singing with them the songs of David, king of Israel, melodies such as no ear has heard since the day our city was destroyed and its people went into exile. I suspect that the angels in charge of the shrine of music, fearful lest I sing in wakefulness what I have sung in dream, made me forget by day what I have sung at night. For if my brethren, the sons of my people, were to hear, they would be unable to bear their grief over the happiness they have lost. To console me for having prevented me from singing with my mouth, they enable me to compose songs in writing. I belong to the tribe of Levi. My forebears and I are of the minstrels that were in the temple. And there is a tradition in my family's father's family that we are of the lineage of the prophet Samuel, whose name I bear. Can you imagine how powerful this must have been when Shai Agnon stood up there in Stockholm to receive give his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize, and to start off by saying that I happen to be born in one of the cities of the exile, but essentially I am a Yerushalmi. How many of us regard ourselves as essentially being Yerushalmis? We know people who are Yerushalmis. We would like to live in Yerushalayim, but the depth of yearning that Agnon had, and of course he was a poet, he was a writer, so his soul was built that way. But nevertheless, that's perhaps what we should be aspiring to. I've got various passages here from Tumol Shilshon, one of his larger novels. We're not going to read all of it, but just to pick up on a few pieces. If you look on, the Hebrew is really, really beautiful. I put the Hebrew here, in here, so that people want to look at the Hebrew and read it through. It's mamish a piyut, but we'll read the English. Page 23. It says, a covenant is made with every city that stamps its seal on its inhabitants, especially the city of God, most exquisite of all cities, where the Shekhinah never moves away from it. And even if the Shekhinah is hidden and covered, there are times and seasons when even the most simple son of Israel, who was blessed to dwell in Jerusalem, will see it, each to the degree of his sensibilities and to his merit, and to the light of grace that illuminates his soul, and by virtue of the suffering he has suffered in the land, and that he accepted with love and did not complain. He's telling us that, the Shekhinah is there. It's just there to be felt, and it depends on how sensitive your soul is. If your soul is attuned to it, you will feel the spirituality of Yerushalayim. Turn over to page 25, and he's got a description of how the protagonist, Yitzchak, went to the Kotel Hamaravi. Beautiful description. The square is full of men and old men and old women. Some sit on benches and stools with books in their hands. Others stand and recite psalms, some in a thin murmur, others with shouts and weeping. Old men stand on this side and embrace the stones of the western wall, and old women stand on that side and cover the stones with tears. Between the stones, grasses grow along the letters of names and requests written there by those who are weary with grief and in need of salvation. And the strip of the firmament stands in its purity, like an eye from above watching from the abode of his holiness from heaven, over Israel and over the land he gave us. Our brothers, the sons of Ishmael, our uncle, who sees the houses next to the western wall come and go, this one with a dung basin on his head and a loaf of bread on it, and that one riding on a donkey carrying manure. And as they walk, they press the worshippers, so their prayers won't rise and bring redemption. And men and women, tourists, descendants of Jacob's brother, stand and point their sticks at the stones of destruction, and at the Jews weeping over their own destruction. When Isaac came, the Sephardi usher grabbed him and called out, Feta, Sinder Lichtel, that is uncle, light a candle. and into his hand he thrust an oil wick for him to light and give him a penny. Isaac had often been to the Western Wall before, but had never gotten close to it because of his humility. Now that he said Kaddish, he approached the holy stones as if by himself. His heart started pounding and his legs tottered, and along with the tottering of his legs and the pounding of his heart, his voice went with the voice of all those standing at the Western Wall, who answered after him, Amen. Yehei Rabbam Avarach. Darkness fell, but daylight still gleamed between the stones of the Western Wall. The men and women tourists went off, and the Arab neighbours of the Western Wall gathered in their houses, and a silence of mercy settled over the holy stones and over the square of the Western Wall. The worshippers tightened their belts and stood up to recite the evening prayer. Between the stones of the Western Wall, a sad voice was heard. Behold, blessed be ye the Lord, all ye servants of the Lord, which by night stand in the house of the Lord. The stones were swallowed up in the gloom, and all the worshippers became one mass before the Lord. Suddenly the moon came out to light the earth. The worshippers finished their prayer and returned to their homes, this one assisting that one, and that one assisting this one, to climb the stairs. Good and sweet are the nights of Jerusalem, as if the Almighty is sorry at night for the evil he did to the city in the day. A wind blows and dust doesn't fly. The moon dispatches her light, and a fine fragrance rises from among the grasses of the rocks. Everyone who can study sits in his house or in the study house and studies, and those who can't study recite psalms. You study a page of Talmud and you become their partner. You read the book of Psalms, and the Holy One, blessed be he, adds your tears to their tears. Everything that was far away from you is close to your heart now. Even our God in heaven is close. Agnon there is describing Yerushalayim b'chul bana, how even in b'chul bana, in its state of desolation, there's an intrinsic beauty to Yerushalayim. So we're going to continue now with Tzion Ateret Savi.
Tzion Ateret Savi, Chatamanayim Shalom Kanarkichim Et Adonai Alei Shechokim Asher Shomrim Chomot V'chel Lelo Yom Yom Kishim Shalom Kanayich Gav Nefotzim V'chol Arba Tzavot V'heim Dorshei Shlomek V'notayich U'anayich Shofnei Dvarim Mechakir Musafir Yom Yish'ech V'az Yizachu Yifir Shenayich ואני בשלי שלומך אקרא כל בראש הרים אזמן לעוף הרעניים. שלום ציון ובית צדק ושלום עלי חילך וחומות יקר אבני פנינייך. שלום לרצוי, שלום לכל הגבול, גלעד ושומרון וכל יתר שכנייך. ציון לפנים הלא היית יפת מפתח, איך להכחו לשחור עדי חופנייך. Kinot lachim yakar atid techilav ich sach tochteri al halatzaych matnayim. Lachmi alacha ve'et hadid tachat ve'er ve'ashtei abonim al panayim. Kumi v'nisa nehi nivkeh dema'ot kayam zlu lahadod v'minay b'inayim. Al umenutech asher halach v'didech v'hu echariv d'viro v'chol sitzrei sef'inayim. Eit yafyech ekara משוררים בשיר, עת החזה עינייך אקרא מקומנייך. אבחר לקעת בכיפות, ישפקו בה, ואוי לי עם אדום בערב, תנו בקנייך. עיר המלוכה לדוד ושלמה בנו הייתם בנויה, והמתד במכונייך. את היא למקדש לאל, את היא מלוכה לצור, את היא אשר יום ביום ירד בפנייך. שם שולחן מנורה, ואדון תמיד, אל בין שני אהבה, למה בגונייך, על מזבחך כהנים עמדו משרתים, במזבח עולה לכפר על פנייך. לא שקונה אשר עפו בגושי יקר, נשמע בשולי מעיל כל פעמונייך, אחת בשנה פנים עליו וחברי דביר, הביא כתרת אלו במזו בחופנייך. קידה וקנה וכל ראש ושמים על די העיר, התמרים בבורח שלנייך. אף הלוויים אשר שומרים שערים, וגם המשוררים שלפה, עם כל פנינייך. וקדם בני מעמד, עורכים תפילה, ולך יעלה המונך בכל פעמי זמנייך. בך הנביאים כבר היו בסוד אל, ובך חכמי תכונה, ובך שתים זקנייך. ארצך מלאה במו 10 קדושות לכל מעשר תרומה, וגם בחרת דברייך. אתה שממת לי בנים ובנות, עמקך לביאייך ולביאייך. מתי ישובון ויבוא בתוך אוהליך, המטהר שכון תחת עינייך. מי יתנן לי לעת לילדים, כמו שפרה ופועה מיילדת באבנייך. מי יתנן לי לעת את אב, ליום יבוא חתנך, ואת חלה וגרי העדי אדוני. לביאה ולחבק בזרועות עפר ארצך, לחשוק בפי נשך אבנייך. לו איך להיות מבני תינופך פתוח, לו לצלול לים ובך עינייך. סוף ואחמוד ולחמה, תשמע לדברי מבשר בכל אוזני ואוזנייך. התעוררי לקראת תודך, תתעוררי מן האדמה, ושוב אמונך.
And we're going to turn now to Shalis Rufa Ba'esh on page 161 in the Rosenfeld, 360 in the Art Scroll, and 591 in the Koren. This is another of the historic Kinot, or historical Kinot. This is by Rabbi Meir of Rosenberg, and it describes the burning of the Talmud in the streets of in Paris in the 13th century. 3 years ago, we looked at this in some detail. Not going to look at it in detail today, but want to particularly read this, having in mind what's happened here in the shul on Monday. Those who were with us for Tefillah on Monday morning, somewhat traumatically, the Sefer Torah snapped. The Eitz Chaim from the Sefer Torah snapped when we did Hadba, and one side of the Sefer Torah shot off and fell onto the floor. And that was obviously a very traumatic event for everybody who was here, and everybody who's here. We've addressed how we're addressing it, but it's there's a question whether we fast or not when you drop a Sefer Torah. It's not mentioned anywhere in Shas or the Shulchan Aruch that you fast when a Sefer Torah is dropped. It is mentioned in the Rishonim, and there are a range of views. Some say it's only the person who dropped it. Some say it's everybody in shul. Some say it's everybody who's a member of the shul, and some say it's even everybody who lives in the neighborhood has to fast, because this is something which makes an impact on everybody in the community. It's not something that anybody can say, oh, well, yeah, I don't come to shul on Monday mornings, so it's not my problem. So we've combined the fast with Tisha B'Av and with Pidyon Tanit by giving money as well. But we also said that one of the things that we would do is contemplate the falling of the Sefer Torah when we read the story of the Shalas Rufa Ba'esh, the burning of the Talmud. And the burning of the Talmud was very significant because, and again, this is one of the things that's happened, repeatedly throughout history. It's been seen many times, and we've seen it, in Nazi Germany, Jewish books were burned, etc. But in the 13th century, to burn 20 cartloads of Sefarim made a really significant dent in Jewish scholarship. There were no printing presses. There was nothing kept on disc. There were no hard, soft copies of things. Who knows how many copies of the Talmud were lost? But every copy was precious. And lots of people learned from one copy of the Talmud. There were texts of the Rishonim which were lost and never to be found again. But this is essentially about Kavod HaTorah. And Kavod HaTorah is something that we have to think about and contemplate. We try hard for Kavod HaTorah, but we can also always try harder. The Gemara Masechet Kiddushin talks about the importance of standing up for a Sefer Torah. The Gemara Masechet Moed Katan talks about when you do Kriya for a Sefer Torah, you do Kriya twice. You do it Kriya for the Gevil and also for the words, for the parchment and for the words. There are two aspects to the Sefer Torah. There's what's actually written there. There's the spirituality as well. And very often when we take out the Sefer Torah from the Aron HaKodesh, we know this is important. We want to hear the Alei. But do we always engage fully with the spirituality of the Sefer Torah as it comes before us, realizing that this is closest manifestation that we can have to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's word at the time of Matan Torah. They could see the words. Now we see them not written in the heaven, but we see them written on the parchment. And we should use it as an opportunity to inspire ourselves to give greater kavod to the Sefer Torah. I wanted to speak a little bit about the historical aspects of the Kinot, and particularly with regard to a historical event that we haven't looked at in the past, but that is the expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290. It's particularly interesting, I think, because we enjoy Jewish life here in England, and in a certain sense, we're going to look at some stuff on pages 13 and 14 in the booklet, but in a certain sense, you can't have it better than Jewish life in London. Okay, New York has more kosher restaurants, and south of France has better weather, but beyond that, Jewish life in London for the past 50, 60, 70 years has been a very fertile breeding ground for creativity, freedom of religion, etc., etc. But that wasn't always the case, and Jewish life in the Middle Ages was difficult. The Jews came to this country essentially with William the Conqueror in 1066. There were Jews who came from Normandy and settled in this country. There might have been a handful here and there from before that. The first settlements of Jews, communities, date to that time. And the Jews were here for about 200 years. And Cecil Roth makes the observation. Cecil Roth was a very prominent Anglo-Jewish historian, professor of history at Oxford University in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. He makes the observation that we have the shortest period of time in England out of all the Jews in Europe. We were the last in and first out. What had happened? Essentially, the Jews in England in the Middle Ages, we were money lenders. Christians weren't allowed to lend money with interest, but Jews, as the infidel, we were allowed to do so. Being a money lender makes you loved and hated. You're loved because you can people can get money that they need, and you're hated when they have to pay back with interest. So the Jews, they were wanted when they were needed, and not wanted when it came to be paying back the money. And there were periodic attacks on Jews throughout this time. Certainly in the end of the 12th century, there were attacks. We know about the York Massacre in 1190. The York Massacre was a function of the Christians of York and the sheriff not wanting to pay back their what they had to pay, and the king wanted to keep the Jews because he put a high tax on them. So it was sort of he was getting his money back. He was borrowing money from the Jews, paying it back with interest, and then getting it all back by putting a high tax on them. And Roth makes the observation that this was squeezing them terribly. So far did the process go that in 1254, the Archpresbyter Elias, in one of the most pathetic speeches recorded in English history, appealed on behalf of his co-religionists for permission to leave the realm, as they had no more left to give. The taxes were so high they couldn't do anything. In any event, in the second half of the 13th century, Jewish England was like Nazi Germany. Read the description on page 14 of what he's got here. So there was the wearing of the Jewish badge in the form of 2 tablets of stone was rigidly enforced. Regulation of 1253 enunciated as a cardinal principle that no Jew remain in England unless he do the king's service, and that from the hour of his birth, every Jew, whether male or female, serve us in some way. Further clauses prohibited the building of new synagogues, enjoined prayer in a subdued voice in those already in existence, lest Christian ears be contaminated, forbade the Jews to have Christian servants or nurses in their employment, to eat meat during Lent, to enter a church, or to settle in any town in which a community was not already to be found. Synagogues were periodically confiscated on the plea that the chanting of them disturbed the service in a neighboring Christian place of worship. The blood libel and similar accusations blazed out again, coming to a head of the classical case of Little Hugh of Lincoln in 1255, which cost 18 persons their lives. From several cities, the Jews were entirely excluded. This is a description of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Can we think, England was a great place to live? Can we imagine the fact that shuls were being closed down, Jews were being driven out, told that we were not allowed to live here? On the next column, he says it was on the 19th of July, 1290. It happened to be by a solemn, tragic coincidence, the 9th of Ab, when a solemn fast commemorated the anniversary of the fall of Jerusalem. A decree was issued ordering all the Jews to leave the country with little more than 3 months. By the Feast of All Souls, 1st of November, all were supposed to have embarked, excepting for a handful who succumbed to the attractions of the house for converted Jews. So we see the Jews were kicked out in 1290. Then turns out it was all a bit weird that Edward realized that this seemed a bit mean on them, so he thought he would be nice to the Jews, and he made a load of rules that whilst they're still here, we've got to be nice to them, and they've got to be given cheap passage across the channel, and anybody who harms them is going to be punished. Well, that's that's going to kick us all out, but give us comfortable slippers, or a red carpet to walk out on. We'd rather stay. But it's chilling to see how history has repeated itself time and time again. And what happened in England in the Middle Ages, or in 1290, happened again in Spain 200 years later, happened in Nazi Germany 400, 500 years later, and various times in between, exactly the same things. And this was anti-Semitism at its very worst, closing down shuls, etc., etc. He's got a story of how one of the boats crossing, taking the Jews across the channel, that the captain of the boat got them all to disembark at low water at a sandbank on the Thames, just telling them, just stretch your legs a little bit, and then he sailed off without them and let them all drown. So it's interesting how many people were expelled from England in 1290. Ever thought of it? So here he says that in all some 16,000 persons, according to the contemporary estimate, perhaps exaggerated, remained steadfast to their faith and sought new homes overseas. This is what he wrote. This was written in the 1920s, 1930s. Encyclopedia Judaica, the entry on the Jews of England, which was also authored by Cecil Roth. So he says it was not more than 4,000. There are very few Jews in England. There were 2 million people in London in the year 1300. So 4,000 Jews in the country is a tiny fraction of how many people there were in the country. So it wasn't a lot of people who were kicked out, but of course it was very significant. And Anglo Jewry, as it was, had amongst it important people. It had Alei Hatosafot, the author of Omnam Cain, on which we say on Kol Nidre night. He lived in England, and there's Rabbi Yaakov Milondre is one of the Balei Hatosafot. He's quoted in the Ramah. Sefer Eitz Chaim of Rabbi Yaakov of Londres is an important work of the Tosafist. There's Tosfot Chachmei Anglia, a commentary on Shas. It's not very big. What we've got is not very big, but it certainly exists. This was a very important, rich community, not rich just in terms of money, though it was wealthy. It was very wealthy in terms of money, but it was also wealthy in terms of scholarship as well, and the Jews were kicked out in 1290. If you look at what I've taken from Wikipedia, don't believe everything that you read on Wikipedia, standard disclaimer, but he describes, again, to be read later, but what the persecution of the Jews in the 100 years leading up to the expulsion. Just it's interesting to note in the first paragraph, it says in 1222, Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, convened the Synod of Oxford, which passed a set of laws that forbade Jews to build new synagogues, own slaves, or mix with Christians in England. So the Nuremberg laws were passed in 1222 in Oxford. Who was Stephen Langton? Anybody remember Stephen Langton? Langdon or Langton? So Stephen Langdon was this interesting quirk of faith. He was the one who divided Tanakh into the chapters that we had. There are no chapters in Tanakh. Every now and then somebody says to me, so why did Shani start at Pasuk 1 instead of, Pasuk 2 instead of Pasuk 1? Or why, in Maaseh Bereshit, does it start where, chapter 2 starts with Vayachulu instead of letting it go through? Or there's a chapter starts one verse before a Petucha or a Setuma. So the answer is because it was a Gentile who put it together. He wasn't interested in the Masoretic tradition. But bearing in mind that Stephen Langton was behind the Synod of Oxford, makes one wonder whether we should talk about chapter 25 or chapter 27. Why should we immortalize him in this way? Because it's an easy way of finding things. I suppose also it was accepted because the first printers of Tanakh were non-Jewish. When the Tanakh was first printed, it was printed by non-Jews. So it just caught on as a way of reference. But it's much better to say, a pasuk in Parashat Devarim. It becomes more complex when you're looking at Nevi'im. It's a pasuk in Yirmiyah. You need good bakiyah of the Yirmiyah. Of course, that's the tragedy. That's highlights the tragedy. We should know where these psukim are, rather than having to rely on Stephen Langton to find them. Charlie Trufa Beish.
Charlie Trufa Beish, the Shlema Vilaye, and the Madin Shakoi, Makatzar Vilaye, Jatin Vanfar, Eretz, Koya, Vim, Hamish, Vim, Alei, Moike, Vilaye. Welcome, Krashik, and the Aimega, the Kalim, the Oiman, Asher, is not Alei, Alai, the Shloim, and Oishana, Kotka, the Lay, Mishbar, Hamid, and Kalim, Alei, Sirei, Kabalaye. They decided to Tanem, Urbanois, Yana, the Yikra, the State, Ma, the Valaye, the Ekam, Suma, the Aisha, to cow the Aish, also, the Loy, the Lutheran, the Kakalaye. As on Adina, the Shaykhan of the Roy Pashke, Lukanei, Farakai, Haroy Kisu, Kabulaye, Tayshay, the Roy Kawa, the Spike, the Nay, Bukal Hamishpotin, the Savi, the Fifth Vilaye. I declare this Roy Gas Age, the Bukin, the Rachel Nashrei, Shay, Shalem not to Vilaye, Suri, Blatet, Age, Al Babur, then Soneki, Vakari say. The hate age the Sulaye. Sina, I have came to call for Paradigm, Umaas, Pick Doylan, the Zorak, the Sulaye. Yours, my face, the dogs, is my eight, the Save, Link to Boydon, the Haynesh, and Show, the Sholaye. Not sure the matter of Shepard for the Mishdate, no, so far, Shelly, Kay, Nasty, Tapas, no, Tis, Cass, the shape the sun. Alter Bush, Almut, Asalit, Smolaye. My eyes had a view, the Nakal, the accused, the preparation, a Sarayatilaye. My Javan, the heart, the Ashal, the Erofatosha, the Kain, this to Gavilaye. Faydash, the Shiv, Hookshar, or the Ashtes, kind of said, oh, Gavi Gavilaye. Oda, the Lukois, the Oishino, Peggy Maltoy, Straight Face off. As that shown to Faylaye. As not enough she ate Garab, the Kiki or Toy, Akaway, I see I shall also do Shalaye, El Toy Fayla, Nidakas, sorrow to Shalalayan, shed the master of Holocaust, Loy, all in Soy, Darab, Silva, Aki Hoya, Vela, the civilization, Silaye. Juntak Team Midrash, den Zeus, den Maschket, den Ois, Ulrachlai, Hayos, Kabut, Varai. Yeah, Alei, Nai, Ois, Main, as if the Colman, as if the space, and not me, yes, the good, read from all the Yai, Abur, Ki, Nitmur, Rakamai, and Doris, all I hear. Holocaust is not as far as there as the miracle. In my Hallel Monsus Alei, the Kishakol, Talmud, Nish, Arti, Levatmehan, serving the Roish Harmik, the Liar. Loyash Maoi, the Coast, Shores, and the Shorois, Alei, Ki, Nitzitu, Heavenly Sukai, Kalivaya. Elbash, the S, Kastasat, Elim, Odio, Peru, ultimately, the third year begun in Namshos, Kalivaya. As man moed al or hayon, asher yizrach el kol avol yak hashem elai, zaki b'kol man v'tzur al shiver nefal al yeh, v'lu yisra avas v'lulayeh. Chibri levushta alei ha'avora, sheyot v'tzor alei v'tzor v'tzor es v'lulayeh. Yimei anisei yenachamei v'tzor v'yashiv sh'bush v'kei sh'run v'yorim es sh'valayeh. Oy, Tadi, Badi, Shoni, the Sotik, Davis is one code the Sahali, the Nukailaya. Yorum, the Babi, the Ace, the Ray, the Arla,
We're going to move on now to our final Kinot for the day, which is traditionally, at least for the past 70 odd years, the Kinot in memory of the victims of the Shoah. And perhaps these are the events that we're most familiar with, and in a certain sense need to talk about, at least because we're very exposed to them in many ways, and we've all learned and seen many of the things to do with the Shoah. And of course, historically, it's not so long ago that it took place, but it's important, I think, for us to consider the Kinot of the Shoah in a number of contexts. Sorry, that's for later. So it's important for us to consider this from a number of perspectives. Number one is that history has this habit of repeating itself, as we've seen throughout the Kinot. So what happened 2,000 years ago, happened 1,500 years ago, and 1,000 years ago, and 500 years ago, and 80 years ago. Second of all, the Shoah is a culmination of everything else that happened. Why did the Shoah happen? Without getting into the theological background to why the Shoah happened, but of course the Shoah happened because we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, and we didn't have Jewish sovereignty, and the nations of the world didn't respect Am Yisrael. And that is, of course, what the Beit HaMikdash should represent for us. It shouldn't. It should make us be a respected nation because of our spirituality and because of our moral compass and because of our closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We don't want the whole world to be frightened of us because we're more physically powerful than anybody else. We want the whole world to respect us because we are has spiritual integrity. And that would be represented by the Beit HaMikdash. And because we didn't have that, that's why all these tragedies have been able to befall us. It's important, I think, when talking about the Shoah, to bear in mind two aspects of the Shoah. Both the tragedy and also the bravery. As far as the tragedy is concerned, I've got a passage here in the booklet. We won't read it together, but it's from a book I found here in the LSJS library, Slingshot of Hell. It's by Rabbi Haparnes, and he was from a rabbinic family in Hungary, and was in Auschwitz twice. Very powerful what he has to write, but it's worth reading during the course of the afternoon. I just want to give you the background. He tells about his family, and that he's written this in memory of his family. Just, since the purpose of this book is to serve as a personal memorial of the events of the Holocaust, I feel obligated to cite, and by doing so immortalize the members of my family who breathed their last breath, sanctifying the holy name. My wife Taube, a woman of valor, a compassionate mother who believed in divine providence and refused to part with her children, her mother and her family. Heaven enabled her to die together with them in the 39th year of her life. My son, Abraham Yitzchak Nissan, who was murdered in a most horrible fashion before my very eyes, a man of spiritual stature, replete with Torah scholarship and innate wisdom in both spiritual matters and worldly things. He died in the 19th year of his life. You've got that account in your pack. My son, Reuven Yoel, a darling, brilliant student who was challenged his teachers. He was 9 years old when he marched with his mother to the gas chamber. My daughter, Miriam, talented, intelligent, pleasant. She was 5 when she was murdered together with her mother. My brother David, he served as a Dayan in Nasud, from whence his name went forth. He had 9 children. His wife died in childbirth, leaving behind a large family. During the 18 years of his widowhood, he married off all his children. He died and all his children died. My sister Shifra lived up to her name. She was superlative in her deeds. Her entire family, she was a mother of 9 orphans. She was a widow, and she had 23 grandsons. Her entire family was brought to Auschwitz, but only 3 survived. My brother Moshe, who was brought to Auschwitz with his wife and 3 children, only 2 survived. My brother Shlomo's family, he died earlier, his wife and 3 married children did not return. My brother Betzalel, his wife and 6 children, 3 of them married, together with their children, were all brought to Auschwitz. None of them returned. They numbered 26 people in all. My brother Yerucham was taken to Auschwitz with his wife and only daughter, who was 19. None of them returned. My brother Yehuda, his wife and 8 children, he alone returned. His family was totally exterminated. All in all, 141 family members went to Auschwitz, of whom only 13 returned. We're not talking about distant family members. We're talking about siblings, nephews, nieces, and grandchildren. 91% were exterminated in the gas chambers. All were outstanding, brave, saintly, God-fearing, perfect, beloved, pleasant in their lifetime. Nor were they separated in their deaths from carrying out the will of their Creator and the plan of their Master. May Hashem bless them with eternal salvation and avenge all the spilt blood. So it's not just sort of something that's happened in Europe. This is families that were wiped out, and perhaps in a certain sense as big as the tragedy of the family being wiped out is the tragedy of seeing your family wiped out. But miraculously, there were people who were able, like Rabbi Cheskel Parnes, who was able to rebuild his family and to go on and to be constructive and productive in life and to leave a legacy as well. At the same time, there were people who were able to observe mitzvot, didn't lose their faith, and observe mitzvot in the camps. You've got a passage from a book about dignity to survive, prayer customs in Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen, when it started off, was not a concentration camp. It was a labor camp. It became a death camp afterwards. When it was a labor camp, people were actually able to film mitzvot. I want to just read a passage from the biography of Rav Amital, Moriv Rabbi, Rosh Hashiva of Yeshivat Har Tzion. He was in various labor camps in the war, and he describes how he and some others were actually able to keep mitzvot. We're on page 32, I think. Keeping mitzvot in the camp was not a simple task. Yehuda managed to keep kosher. He left over the meat that was provided for the inmates and subsisted on dry bread and onions. He also managed to put on tefillin every day, but he was forced to violate Shabbat in order to work. Nevertheless, he tried to mark the beginning of Shabbat in various ways, depending on his situation. Those of us who learned in Gush might remember him talking about this on more than one occasion. One Friday, he put a clean shirt in his pocket. When Shabbat began, he quickly, while working, took off his sweaty shirt and put on the laundered shirt in honor of Shabbat. When he finished changing shirts, he quietly declared Shabbos and was filled with the satisfaction of successfully marking the transition from profane to sacred, even while working. I seem to recall him saying that on some occasions he didn't even have the second shirt, but he turned his shirt inside out so that the cleaner side would be on the outside, or the dirtier side on the inside. The difficulty in keeping mitzvot at the camp in Grossvarden led Yehuda to jump at the opportunity that presented itself a few months later, to go out with a group of young men, all of whom were observant of the Torah mitzvot, to work at a local village. Also in this group was Wolf Weiss, a cousin of Yehuda's father, whose wife and children had already been sent to Auschwitz. He was sent with Yehuda to a labor camp. The 15 group members managed to reach an agreement with the 2 Hungarian officers in charge of them. Instead of working on Shabbat, they would work extra hours during the week. They also found a solution for kosher food. The butcher attached to the group was discovered to be a Jew. The officers supplied him with kosher foods to cook, mainly potatoes. And for those few weeks, the prisoners could enjoy cooked kosher food. Additionally, the religious group had a small Torah scroll and a small shofar that they managed to smuggle out of the abandoned ghetto in Grossvarden. Rav Amital, somebody who lost his mother and siblings and his grandmother in Auschwitz, nevertheless, he had the courage and the faith to be able to carry on. And these are the two sides of the coin that we see about the Shoah, the tragedy and the bravery as well. And I think we remember both of them on Tisha B'Av. We're going to read the Kinot together on page 173 in the Rosenfeld, or on the handouts that you've got if you don't have the Rosenfeld. Eicha tifarteinu me'roshenu hishlachta, eicha panecha memenu histarta, eicha katzafta v'lo chamalta, v'leiv nishbar nidke b'yom tzom v'atzara, banu lefanecha lispot v'livkot v'kina v'ilala, v'zochreinu et kedoshei hashoah tartzat tasha, G'on Yaakov asher ahavta shibarta, Gada taramei hakoma v'agvoim ishbalta, Gafneinu l'shama u'teinatenu l'ktsafa samta, Davku atzameinu l'oreinu v'sareinu, Dachod ikita la'aretz chayenu, Dalfa metugav anachan nafsheinu, Hanei avim v'animim v'yisharim v'hatmimein, Tanu ba'kronot kifrasimu v'karim, Hachom machanak v'aptakim chatumim, Vatikim yoshvim al haaretz domimim, v'mehayta chatatam hem shoalim, v'lama nigzar hadin b'li rechamim, Zachor tizkor et zakat hanavim, zakat hayitomim hagalmudim b'nezavim, zizul chachamim v'talmideihem ha'ahuveim, chayalim rashei beit avot giborim, naflu milyonim, Cherpal neshama hayta lagoyim, Tipachnu v'ribinu hafsa kilam hashimam, Tarof tarfu kisevim lishpok tamam, Tavach sheish meot ribo mizamam, Yardu chayim she'ola b'shma Yisrael u'v'ani mamen, Yatsu nishmotem utzarim utaletu b'tfilen, Yevoshu b'kalmu, V'yu cha'ayin harotzachein, Kala she'ereinu v'aveinu al shever chelkeinu, Kulanu nosim kina abovdan chamsi ameinu, Ish kula shoah kisreifat v'eiz Eloheinu, L'Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Meidanik, Treblinka, L'chuvu d'chuku b'chadrei gas, V'nisruhu b'moktot ha'kivshanim b'cherpa, Lachamu ha'kdoshim ha'torim v'naflu, Chagiburim ghetto Varsha, Mikol pina azoakim t'mehem ha'krushem, Matai avokei tzlav gaim hanushim, Vispeit mar v'kinasu al ha'kdoshim, Na'atzu ha'noatzim et habrit v'et Torateinu, Naflu aleinu m'chorfecha, V'nivke b'tzom nafsheinu, Nafla teret rosheinu, Oina l'nachalateinu. Sifrei Torah Lingzarim Karu V'Timu B'Deihem Sarku B'Sar Sheirenu V'Oram Havchu L'Kishuteihem Siftu V'Chigru Sak Be'elinu Alehem V'Al Tapeihem Einenu Zolgot Dam D'Maot Al Sreifat Batei Chinesiot Al Arisa Tishivot Batei Midrashot Harzu Kilotenu V'Harsu Adatenu Pachad Kra'anu Ra'ata Chazatanu Banenu Kistach Nima B'Tzarotenu Tiarku B'Cheser B'Chafan Tunot B'Nafshan Shalchu Yadan Zakavi Yamsuf Lishma Kolan Krovim V'Didim Chavivim Chasidim Visharim Kedoshim Torim Kezohar Rakyam Asirim Kabaleim Asireim V'Seisech Nafech Olamim Rachum Zechob Racham Echad Shridei Nachalatecha Ribon Holamim Haser Dagav Tukam Me'amecha Rishat HaGoyim Sonei Yisrael Ta'aker B'Zamecha Shuyim Hadrev Kach Koach L'Asureinu Shemen Sason Tachat Evel Ta'atereinu Shalom L'Shalva Ta'asim Nanu L'Artseinu Tarim Kanim Tachish Kulatenu B'Meirav Yameinu Tagel Araba V'Tifrach Kalachat Selet Yisrael Medinatenu Tvarachenu B'Birkat Abraham Yitzchak Yaakov Avoteinu. We're going to conclude in a moment with Tzion. Tzion is a bit of an enigma. It sounds happy. It's got a jaunty tune, but it's a Kinot. If we look at the words, the tune doesn't seem to make sense. And this is Mamash a Kinot. Got a few questions about it. We're not going to go through it now. Time is against us. But you've got on the back page from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in Halakhot Shlomo, the end of the paragraph, it says, "Vayarabim Tama, Matam Magulakum Me'al Gabe Karka Lamirat Tzion." Why do we get up? Why do we stand up when we say Tzion? Sorry, Mikhlala Kinot, She'ofen Amiratani B'Shivata B'Shiva La'aretz Kaveilin. It's one of the Kinot, and we're supposed to say it sitting down like Kaveilin. Right, like Arei Shomon Titain, Kol Titain, it's Simon Pesukei Nechama. The Pesukei Nechama come afterwards. So Shlomo Zalman was of the opinion that we should actually stay sitting for Tzion. It's a Kinot. That's not the minhag. He felt that we should, and other people do. I'm not going to change that. But if we look at it, look at the words, and this is a challenge throughout all the Kinot to keep an eye on the English as well. Now, how can we sing? That's when we talk about young woman girds with sackcloth in mourning for the husband of her youth, and the blood that was shed thick as the waters of her rivers, the meeting place that is desolate, and the dissolution of the Sanhedrin. How can we have such a jaunty tune? So a couple of observations. One observation is that I think we need to sing it in a less jaunty way. It's a Kinot still. The second is, and look at the passage here from Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik says, whenever we want to express the endlessness of our longing, the intensity of our loneliness for the Beit HaMikdash and our strong faith, hope and expectations that redemption will finally materialize, we use the melody of Tzion Ba'areha. And the same is true of B'nei Beit Chakavat Chila, when we also use this melody, are waiting for the arrival of the Messiah and the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash has no limit. So for a long time I was sort of confused about this. Try and fit in a Tzion tune to B'nei Beit Chakavat Chila. Shmuel, how does B'nei Beit Chakavat Chila go? Bali Tefillah? Right, B'nei Beit Chakavat Chila. How does that fit in with Tzion? You have to be very imaginative. So for a while I was very imaginative and thought that I could see it. But then I discovered there are different ways of singing Tzion. Listen, if you will, to Tzion being sung in the Chevron Yeshiva. And you will hear B'nei Beit Chakavat Chila.
This tiny device has changed the way I eat breakfast every day.
Sorry. And also in Ponevezh Yeshiva, listen carefully. You've got exactly that. Tzion v'yareha, b'nei veitcha kavat achila. It's exactly the same tune. So, almost exactly the same tune. So, therefore, we see there are different ways of singing it. But I want to conclude. I found online on Times of Israel an insight from Rabbi Michael Whiteman, who is a rabbi in Canada, and he points out that we've got two different metaphors here. We've got a woman giving birth, a woman in birth pangs, and we've got a woman who's mourning her husband. But they're very different from each other, and they speak to different eras of history and different experiences. Like a young woman mourning the husband of her youth is truly tragic. She will never be the same. He will never return. For almost 2,000 years, that was our perception of what's happened to Jerusalem and Israel. Like a woman in her birth pains is so different. Not in the severity of her pain, but in the duration, the result. A woman may suffer terribly in childbirth, but with God's help, though sadly there are exceptions, it ends in birth, it ends in life, it ends in joy. And that, of course, is what we're looking forward to at the end of the Kinot. Alei Tzion v'yareha, kamo isha b'tzireha, v'hitulav ha'gurasa, alleluia, Alei amor asher b'tash, v'yash nachzor natareha, V'yam nacharayam, v'tzom mitash chazareha, Alei galut m'sharatel, v'nei shir zamareha, v'yam avam asher shura, k'monei yaoreha, Asher tamam v'yareha, v'yavlav asher shoneh, v'yishul samedreha, alei zichei zeviteha, v'fid yamei b'choreha, v'yavkilu k'mei heitan, Alei tamei v'machreha, v'nei tamid k'vireha, v'yam yafyam asher roshan, v'nei sarut v'zoreha, Alei tamoi asher galo, v'nei korban v'vireha, v'yalav asher the songs of Kinot, Alei Mahas Koromakos, Asher Lukun Yisireha, V'yam Yikus Alei Seha, Alei Simchas Asareha, V'sofer Kamal Shafareha, V'yam Yidui V'nei Chorin, V'yirah Zahoreha, Alei Mesha Asher Zedulena Ashureha, V'yam Zevot Kahaleha, Zedulena Ashureha, Alei Kavos Mechareha, V'yei Prabhu V'yareha, V'yam Rishas Mechareha, V'tzom Rishas Hasereha, Alei Shimcha Asher Kula, V'ti Kamei Yisraeleha, Drachens, Yom Kasher, Matot, Chonea, Kasher, Tivarta, Maher Shal, Takish, Kulam, Tashu, Shalbrach, Ami Rabbi, Kakatubaya, Liecha, Lacha, Kama, Adonai, Shaf, Shalbrach, Ami, Beiti, Mane, Banu, Madonai, Fort, Kami, Natal, Shal, Nemar, Odkurane, Mo, Kama, Adonai, Fort, Od, Selaram, Top, Nikama, Adonai, Tzion, Ulachar, Yerushalayim, Nemar, Ki Nicham, Adonai, Tzion, Nicham, Kotel, Vayasem Midbar Ka'ezen Marvata Kigan Adonai Sason Simcha Yimat Seba Toda Kol Simra Ashri